It began with a city already dying, long before the first shells landed in its streets. Berlin in the spring of 1945 was no longer the capital of a rising power. It was a collapsing center, hollowed out by years of war, air raids, and certainty turned into denial. The war had already been lost everywhere else. What remained now was the end and the decision of how violently it would arrive. The Battle of Berlin was not fought to change the outcome of the war. It was fought because the war could no longer stop itself. From the east, the Red Army surged forward with overwhelming force. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, endless artillery, not moving to negotiate, not moving to delay, but moving to finish. From the west, Allied armies had already crossed the Rhine and were advancing deep into Germany. But Berlin was marked for one final reckoning from the east. The city was surrounded not just by armies, but by inevitability. Inside Berlin, reality fractured. Civilians hid in basements that shook day and night. Children carried messages and weapons. Old men and teenagers were pressed into uniform and sent to the front. There was no longer a front line in the traditional sense. Every street was a position, every building a fortress, every intersection a possible last stand. The city itself became the battlefield. The Soviet assault began with fire. Artillery pounded Berlin with a force almost beyond comprehension. The ground trembled continuously. Entire neighborhoods collapsed into dust and flame. The air filled with smoke so thick it turned daylight into dusk. And behind that wall of fire came infantry and armor, advancing block by block, absorbing casualties and pressing forward without pause. German resistance inside the city was desperate and fragmented. Some units fought with discipline, others fought with fanaticism. Many fought simply because there was nowhere left to go. Orders from above grew increasingly detached from reality. Hitler remained in the bunker, issuing commands to units that no longer existed, clinging to fantasies of relief armies that would never come. Around him, the machinery of the regime finally began to consume itself. Street fighting in Berlin was brutal and intimate. Rooms were cleared one by one. Stairwells became killing zones. Basements filled with the wounded and dying. Tanks fired at point-blank range. Infantry fought through rubble that erased all sense of direction. Progress was measured not in kilometers, but in floors and staircases. The city resisted not because it could win, but because it had not yet accepted defeat. Civilians paid the highest price. Caught between collapsing authority and advancing armies, millions endured hunger, fear, and violence as the city disintegrated around them. Berlin was not liberated cleanly. It was taken, and the taking left scars that would last generations. As Soviet forces closed in on the center, the final symbols of the regime collapsed. The bunker fell silent. Orders stopped coming. The illusion ended. When Berlin finally surrendered, it did not feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion. The Battle of Berlin matters not because it was the last battle in Europe, but because it shows what happens when war is allowed to go on long after its outcome is decided. It shows the cost of refusal, the cost of denial, the cost of leaders who choose destruction over surrender. It was the end of a city's suffering and the beginning of a reckoning the world would spend decades trying to understand. Tonight, we return to those final days, to the rubble and fire, to the streets where history closed one chapter in the most violent way imaginable, to Berlin where the Second World War in Europe finally ended, not with clarity, but with collapse. And before we go any further, if you're still here, listening quietly, if these long, careful journeys into history help you slow down, reflect, or understand the world a little more deeply, then I hope you'll consider subscribing. I'm a small creator, building this channel one story at a time without shouting, without shortcuts, and without turning tragedy into spectacle. When you subscribe, you're not just supporting a channel, you're helping keep this kind of thoughtful, immersive storytelling alive. If this space gives you perspective, calm, or a place to sit with history honestly, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the complete history of the Battle of Berlin. January 12th, 1945. The Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra plays Wagner to a packed house at the Admiralspalast Theater. Crystal chandeliers glitter overhead as violins swell through a passage from Die Walküre. The audience, dressed in their finest surviving clothes, sits transfixed by the music. Outside, beneath the same stars that illuminate the concert hall's dome, thousands of refugees from the eastern provinces pour into Anhalter Station. They carry what remains of their lives in suitcases and burlap sacks. The trains disgorge women with hollow eyes, children with frostbitten fingers, old men who have walked 200 kilometers through snow. But inside the theater, the music continues. The conductor's baton rises and falls. The crowd applauds. Nobody mentions that Soviet artillery, at this very moment, is being positioned just 60 kilometers away on the banks of the Oder River. This was Berlin in the winter of 1945, a city living in two realities simultaneously. On one hand, the machinery of daily life continued with remarkable persistence. Cafes still served ersatz coffee made from acorns. Department stores displayed dresses that no one could afford. The U-Bahn trains ran on schedule, carrying workers to factories that produced weapons for an army that barely existed anymore. Theaters showed films, schools taught children. Ration cards were honored, though they provided increasingly meager portions. On the surface, Berlin functioned. But beneath this facade of normalcy, everyone knew the truth. The Reich was collapsing. The question was no longer whether Berlin would fall, but when. And yet, impossibly, life went on. This psychological split, this ability to maintain routine while catastrophe approached, would define the city's character in its final months. The people of Berlin had survived 5 years of war, countless bombing raids, the loss of fathers and sons and brothers. They had learned to endure. Now they would learn whether endurance was enough. The numbers told a story that contradicted the concert halls and cafes. Berlin's population had shrunk from 4.3 million in 1939 to just 2.9 million by January 1945. Where had everyone gone? Some had died in the bombing raids that had turned entire neighborhoods into moonscapes of rubble. Others had been conscripted, sent east to fight the Soviets or west to face the Americans and British. Thousands had evacuated voluntarily, recognizing what the government refused to admit. But nearly 3 million remained. They stayed for many reasons. Some had nowhere else to go. Others refused to abandon homes their families had occupied for generations. Many simply couldn't believe that Berlin, the capital of the thousand-year Reich, the heart of Nazi power, could actually fall. After all, wasn't Berlin ringed with anti-aircraft batteries? Didn't the city have massive fortifications? The propaganda ministry assured them daily that victory was still possible, that new wonder weapons would turn the tide, that the alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western democracies would collapse any day now. Belief, even desperate belief, is a powerful thing. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, worked overtime to maintain the illusion. His ministry distributed leaflets showing maps of inevitable German victory. According to these maps, German forces would counterattack from Norway, from Italy, from the Rhineland. They would encircle the Soviet armies and march back to Moscow. The maps were beautiful works of fantasy, printed on increasingly cheap paper with increasingly desperate typography. Goebbels himself knew they were lies. His diary entries from this period reveal a man who understood the war was lost, yet who continued to perform his role with theatrical dedication. On January 15th, he stood before a crowd in the Sportpalast and declared that Berlin would never surrender. His voice echoed through the hall with the same magnetic intensity that had mesmerized crowds a decade earlier. The audience roared approval. Some of them believed him, but many simply wanted to believe, wanted it so badly that they accepted whatever hope was offered, no matter how transparently false. This was the psychology of a doomed city. Not blind faith, but chosen delusion. Meanwhile, preparations for the city's defense revealed the enormous gap between propaganda and reality. The Wehrmacht began organizing Berlin's civilian population into defensive units. They called it the Volkssturm, the People's Militia. The name evoked images of patriotic citizens rising to defend their homeland, like the Prussian levies that had fought Napoleon. The reality was sadder and more desperate. The Volkssturm consisted primarily of men too old or too young for regular military service. Boys as young as 14 were handed rifles they could barely lift. Men in their 60s, some of them veterans of the First World War, were issued armbands and sent to dig tank traps in parks where they had once walked their children. By January 1945, Berlin had mobilized 60,000 of these Volkssturm members. They received minimal training, often just a few hours of instruction on how to operate a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon. Most had no uniforms, just armbands to identify them as combatants. Many had no weapons at all initially, told they would receive them when the time came. They dug trenches in the frozen ground of the Tiergarten. They stacked sandbags around government buildings, and they wondered whether they would actually be expected to fight. The Hitler Youth, meanwhile, approached the coming battle with a disturbing combination of enthusiasm and naivety. For 12 years, these children had been indoctrinated with Nazi ideology. They had grown up singing songs about sacrifice for the fatherland, watching films that glorified combat, attending camps where instructors taught them that dying for Hitler was the highest honor imaginable. Now, with the Reich crumbling, they volunteered in droves. Boys who should have been studying for school examinations instead learned to prime hand grenades. Girls who should have been attending dances instead trained as auxiliary anti-aircraft gunners. The Hitler Youth leadership distributed Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons to teenagers with the casualness of teachers handing out textbooks. These weapons were simple to operate, just aim the tube, pull the trigger, and a shaped charge would shoot out, capable of destroying even the heaviest Soviet tank. In theory, a determined 14-year-old could hold off an armored assault. In practice, using a Panzerfaust meant revealing your position and inviting immediate, overwhelming retaliation. But the Hitler Youth had been raised on stories of sacrifice. They didn't think about survival. They thought about glory. The disconnect between Berlin's continued functioning and its impending doom was perhaps best illustrated by the city's supplies situation. In January 1945, Berlin's warehouses contained approximately 41 days of full rations. This meant that if supply lines were cut, which everyone knew was inevitable, the city could feed its nearly 3 million inhabitants for just over a month before starvation began. Yet bakeries still opened each morning. Butcher shops still displayed sausages made from God knows what meat. The rationing system still worked with German efficiency, providing each citizen with their allotted calories of bread, potatoes, and the occasional bit of fat or protein. People grumbled about the quality, but they ate. They survived. The authorities had calculated that as long as people had food, even meager food, they would maintain hope, and hope meant compliance. The moment the food ran out, social order would collapse. Goebbels knew this. The military commanders knew this. Even ordinary Berliners knew this, though they didn't speak of it openly. So everyone participated in the collective pretense that 41 days of rations was somehow sufficient, that surely the situation would resolve itself before the warehouses emptied. Yet beneath all this denial, beneath the concerts and the cafes and the ration queues, fear grew like a tumor. The refugees arriving from the east brought stories that the authorities couldn't suppress. They spoke of Soviet troops advancing with terrifying speed, crushing German defenses, showing no mercy to soldiers or civilians. They described villages burned, women assaulted, men shot. The government dismissed these accounts as exaggerations or outright fabrications, enemy propaganda designed to terrorize the population. But the refugees kept coming. Their faces told a story that no propaganda could counteract. They had seen something terrible approaching from the east, and they had run. Now they huddled in Berlin's train stations and emergency shelters, waiting for the thing they had fled to catch up with them. Some Berliners who heard these stories began making their own preparations. They packed bags with essential documents, photographs, whatever valuables could be easily carried. They planned escape routes westward, toward the American and British lines. But most stayed. Where would they go? Germany was collapsing from all sides. And so they remained in Berlin, going about their routines, maintaining normalcy, hoping that somehow they would be spared the fate that seemed inevitable. On the last Sunday of January, a remarkable scene unfolded in the Grunwald district. Despite the war, despite the approaching enemy, despite everything, Berliners crowded into the parks for their traditional weekend promenade. Families walked together beneath bare winter trees. Couples strolled arm in arm. Children played in the snow, building snowmen and throwing snowballs, their laughter cutting through the cold air. For a few hours, it was possible to forget that the world was ending. This was what Berlin clung to, these moments of ordinary life. These small rituals that connected the present to the past. The city had survived the 30 Years' War, survived Napoleon, survived the chaos of the Weimar Republic. Surely it would survive this too. This was the collective delusion that sustained Berlin through the winter of 1945. Not ignorance, but willful blindness. Not stupidity, but the very human inability to truly accept catastrophe until it arrives. The people of Berlin saw the refugees. They heard the distant sounds of artillery. They read between the lines of Goebbels' increasingly desperate speeches. They knew, and yet they went to concerts. They queued for rations. They sent their children to school. They lived. This strange, suspended state, this twilight between the city that was and the ruins it would become, could not last. Even as Berliners walked in the Grunewald, even as the Philharmonic played Wagner, Soviet forces were positioning themselves for the final assault. Marshal Georgy Zhukov stood before maps showing Berlin circled in red marker. Stalin demanded the city's capture by May 1st, International Workers' Day, a symbolic deadline that would cost tens of thousands of lives. In the frozen forests east of the Oder River, 2.5 million Soviet soldiers checked their weapons and waited for the order to advance. They had fought their way across 2,000 kilometers of devastated landscape. They had seen what the Germans had done to their homeland, the burned villages, the mass graves, the scorched earth. Now they stood at the gates of the enemy's capital, and they intended to exact revenge. The distance between Berlin's concert halls and Soviet artillery positions was just 60 kilometers. It might as well have been the distance between two different worlds. But those worlds were about to collide. The city that thought it was invincible was about to learn otherwise. The music would stop, the lights would go out, and Berlin would burn. January 12th, 1945, 4 a.m. The darkness along the Vistula River erupts into light. Not dawn, but something more violent, a man-made sunrise of artillery fire stretching across 300 kilometers of front line. Soviet guns, carefully positioned and camouflaged for weeks, begin the largest barrage in human history. 20,000 artillery pieces fire simultaneously. The sound is beyond description, beyond anything previously experienced in warfare. It's not just loud, it's a physical force that shakes the earth, collapses buildings 20 kilometers away, and causes German soldiers in their trenches to bleed from their ears. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, watching from his command post, consults his watch and allows himself a thin smile. The Vistula-Oder offensive has begun. In 23 days, his forces will cover 295 miles. They will shatter 3 German army groups. They will advance at a speed that makes even the German blitzkrieg of 1940 look slow by comparison. And they will reach the Oder River, placing Soviet artillery within striking distance of Berlin itself. But on this dark January morning, all of that is still future. Right now, there is only thunder. The scale of the Soviet operation was staggering. 3 fronts, the first Belarusian under Zhukov, the first Ukrainian under Marshal Ivan Konev, and the second Belarusian under Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky would advance in coordinated waves. Together they commanded 2.2 million men, 7,000 tanks, and 14,000 aircraft. The Germans facing them had been bled white by years of brutal combat. Army Group A, defending Poland, possessed perhaps 500,000 troops and 700 operational tanks. Many of their divisions existed only on paper in reality. They were scattered battalions with outdated equipment and exhausted soldiers. The numerical superiority was crushing. 5.5 to 1 in troops, 7.8 to 1 in tanks, 20 to 1 in artillery. But numbers alone don't explain what happened next. The Soviet advance wasn't just powerful, it was sophisticated. Zhukov and his fellow marshals had learned from 4 years of brutal combat. They had studied German tactics, analyzed their defeats, and adapted. Now, they would demonstrate that the Red Army had evolved from the fumbling giant of 1941 into a precision instrument of destruction. The initial German resistance collapsed within hours. The artillery barrage had been carefully timed to catch defenders during shift changes, when tired troops were being relieved by fresh ones, meaning both groups were above ground rather than sheltered in bunkers. German command posts disintegrated. Communication lines, already fragile, snapped completely. Officers attempting to coordinate responses found themselves shouting into dead telephones. Then came the tanks. Soviet 34 mediums and IS-2 heavy tanks crashed through what remained of German defenses like hammers through glass. They didn't stop to fight every strong point. Instead, they bypassed resistance, leaving infantry to mop up while the armor raced westward. This was mobile warfare taken to its logical extreme. German units that survived the barrage found themselves surrounded within hours, cut off from supply and support. Some fought to the last man, others surrendered immediately. Many simply disintegrated, soldiers abandoning their weapons and attempting to flee westward ahead of the Soviet advance. By nightfall on January 12th, Zhukov's forces had penetrated 30 kilometers into German-held territory. The front line, static for months, had simply ceased to exist. On January 17th, Soviet forces liberated Warsaw. The capital of Poland, occupied since September 1939, was free. But liberation is perhaps the wrong word. The Warsaw that Soviet troops entered was barely recognizable as a city. The Germans, in their systematic destruction following the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, had reduced the capital to rubble. Entire neighborhoods had been dynamited. The medieval old town lay in ruins. Of Warsaw's pre-war population of 1.3 million, fewer than 100,000 remained. Soviet soldiers advanced through streets lined with the shells of buildings, past courtyards filled with frozen corpses, through intersections where street signs pointed to neighborhoods that no longer existed. The propaganda value was enormous. Stalin could now claim to have avenged Poland and fulfilled the Soviet Union's alliance obligations. But Warsaw's liberation also revealed the war's fundamental cruelty. The city had been destroyed by Germans. Now it would be occupied by Soviets. For Poles, the question of which foreign power controlled their capital was less important than the fact that their capital had ceased to exist. Still, for the Red Army, Warsaw's fall was symbolically crucial. They were reversing history, erasing the humiliation of 1939 when Soviet forces had invaded Poland from the east while Germans invaded from the west. Now, they were the liberators, advancing west toward Berlin itself. The speed of the Soviet advance shocked both sides. German intelligence had anticipated a winter offensive, but nothing like this. They expected the Soviets would advance perhaps 50 kilometers before logistics forced a pause. Instead, Soviet units covered that distance in 3 days and kept going. The key was Zhukov's logistical preparation. For months, Soviet engineers had been stockpiling supplies, building roads, and positioning mobile repair facilities. When the offensive began, trucks and horse-drawn wagons moved forward constantly, keeping combat units supplied with ammunition, fuel, and food. Trains ran behind the advancing front, their cars loaded with shells and spare parts. Mobile field hospitals followed the tanks, treating wounded and sending them rearward within hours. The Germans had pioneered blitzkrieg, but the Soviets had perfected it. By January 22nd, just 10 days into the offensive, Zhukov's lead elements had covered 150 kilometers. They were approaching the pre-war German border. German commanders began preparing not to hold Poland, but to defend the Reich itself. For the German soldiers in the path of this avalanche, the experience was nightmarish. Lieutenant Werner Kleemann, serving with the 19th Panzer Division, later described the offensive in his memoir. "We knew they were coming," he wrote. "We heard the artillery, saw the red flares, understood that this was the big push. But we didn't comprehend the scale. We thought in terms of local breakthroughs that we could contain. Instead, the entire front simply dissolved. I spent 3 days retreating westward, never stopping, never fighting, just trying to stay ahead of their tanks. We abandoned equipment, vehicles, wounded men. Units that tried to make a stand disappeared. You would see smoke on the horizon and know that some battalion had decided to fight, and an hour later, Soviet tanks would roll past the position, leaving it behind like an island in a flood. The only goal was to reach the Oder before they did, to establish some kind of defensive line before they pushed into Germany itself. Kleemann's company started the offensive with 120 men. By the time they reached the Oder, 38 remained. They hadn't fought a single sustained engagement. They had simply run, and most hadn't run fast enough. The civilian experience of the offensive was, if anything, more traumatic than the military one. The German population of Poland and East Prussia, some 2 million people, had lived in these territories for generations. Many families had farmed the same land for centuries. They considered themselves as German as any resident of Berlin or Munich. Now, suddenly, they were in the path of the Red Army. The Nazi propaganda ministry had spent years describing Soviet soldiers as barbaric subhumans who would commit unspeakable atrocities. Much of this was racist fantasy designed to motivate German soldiers. But some of it reflected reality. Soviet troops, having witnessed what Germans had done to the Soviet Union, were not inclined toward mercy. As the Red Army advanced, German civilians fled westward in massive columns. Families loaded wagons with whatever they could carry. They abandoned homes, farms, businesses, everything built over generations. The roads west became clogged with refugees. Old people who couldn't keep pace were left beside the road, wrapped in blankets, waiting to die from exposure or Soviet capture. Children became separated from parents in the chaos. Pregnant women gave birth in frozen fields. And still, the refugees kept moving, driven by terror of what would happen if the Soviets caught them. By late January, the Soviet advance began to slow. Not because of German resistance, the Wehrmacht was too shattered to offer sustained opposition, but because of logistics. Even the Red Army's impressive supply system had limits. Trucks broke down, fuel supplies dwindled. The tanks that had covered 300 kilometers in 3 weeks needed maintenance and repairs. Zhukov's forces reached the Oder River on January 31st, establishing bridgeheads on the western bank near Kustrin. They were now just 60 kilometers from Berlin. Soviet reconnaissance teams, equipped with powerful binoculars, could see the spires of Berlin's churches in the distance, on clear days. Victory seemed within reach. Surely one more push, one final offensive would bring the war to an end. But Stalin and his marshals made a crucial decision. Instead of immediately pushing toward Berlin, they would pause. They would consolidate their positions, bring up supplies, and prepare properly. The final assault on Berlin would wait until spring. This decision, prudent from a military standpoint, gave Berlin 2 months to prepare, 2 months to fortify, 2 months to organize defenses, and 2 months for hope to die slowly instead of being extinguished all at once. The Vistula-Oder offensive was, by any measure, one of history's most impressive military operations. Soviet forces had advanced 295 miles in 23 days, an average of nearly 13 miles per day across winter terrain, against a defending enemy. For comparison, the German invasion of France in 1940, considered the epitome of blitzkrieg, averaged 10 miles per day. The Soviets had refined mobile warfare to a degree that exceeded even German expertise at its peak. They had demonstrated that the Red Army of 1945 bore little resemblance to the poorly led, poorly equipped force that had struggled in 1941. German casualties were catastrophic. Approximately 250,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during the offensive. 400 tanks were destroyed. Entire divisions simply ceased to exist. For the Wehrmacht, already stretched thin on multiple fronts, these losses were irreplaceable. The Soviet casualties were also severe: 43,251 killed and 194,191 total casualties. But the Red Army could absorb such losses. Germany could not. The geopolitical implications extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The Vistula-Oder offensive established Soviet control over Poland and positioned Soviet forces to dominate Central Europe. When World War II ended, the Soviet Union would not withdraw from the territories conquered during this operation. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, all would become Soviet satellites, not because of diplomatic negotiations, but because Red Army divisions occupied them. The post-war map of Europe was being drawn not in conference rooms, but by the advance of Soviet tanks. Winston Churchill, watching from London, understood this perfectly. In a meeting with his military chiefs on February 3rd, he remarked that Europe was being divided into spheres of influence by the movement of armies, and that this division would likely persist long after the shooting stopped. He was, of course, correct. The Cold War began not in 1946 or 47, but in January 1945, on the frozen plains of Poland, as Soviet forces raced toward Berlin and Western forces remained on the Rhine. The world was being reshaped by the speed of Zhukov's offensive and the decision to pause at the Oder. Berlin had 2 months to live. The Red Army would make sure those 2 months felt like an eternity. February 1st. 1945. Colonel Wilhelm Bahrenfänger stands in the ruins of a Berlin apartment building, studying a map spread across a table made from ammunition crates. The map shows Berlin divided into 9 concentric defensive rings. Each ring is marked with symbols indicating strong points, anti-tank barriers, artillery positions. The map is beautifully detailed, a masterpiece of military planning. There's only one problem. The forces needed to defend these positions don't exist. Bahrenfänger's finger traces the outer ring, which calls for 12 full-strength divisions. He commands perhaps the equivalent of 2 divisions, scraped together from remnants, training units, and Volkssturm militias. The middle rings require hundreds of anti-tank guns. He has dozens, many without sufficient ammunition. The inner rings show bunkers and fortified buildings that exist only on paper. Bahrenfänger closes his eyes and considers the mathematics of defending a city with ghosts. The equation doesn't balance. But orders are orders, and Hitler has decreed that Berlin will become a fortress. So Bahrenfänger will try to build a fortress from rubble, hope, and teenagers who barely know which end of a rifle to hold. The concept of Fortress Berlin was born from desperation rather than strategy. After the Soviet advance reached the Oder, Hitler convened a series of meetings with military commanders to discuss the capital's defense. The Führer insisted that Berlin could and would be held indefinitely. He cited examples from history. Leningrad had withstood a 900-day siege. After all, Berlin, with its massive buildings and infrastructure, could do the same. His generals tried to explain that Leningrad had survived because supplies could be brought across Lake Ladoga. Berlin had no such lifeline. They tried to explain that defending a city of 3 million civilians required food, water, and medical supplies that didn't exist. Hitler dismissed their objections. He ordered that Berlin be fortified immediately and held to the last man and the last bullet. The phrase sounded dramatic. In practice, it meant condemning the city to destruction. But no one in the room dared say this aloud. So the fortification began, an exercise in constructing defenses that everyone privately knew were inadequate. The defensive plan divided Berlin into 9 sectors, arranged in concentric rings. The outer ring, designated as Ring A, followed the city's administrative boundaries roughly 25 kilometers from the center. This ring was supposed to stop the initial Soviet assault, giving defenders time to fall back to prepared positions. Ring B ran along the S-Bahn railway circle, about 15 kilometers from the center. Subsequent rings grew progressively smaller, with the innermost ring protecting the government district around the Reich Chancellery. On paper, the plan was sound. In practice, implementing it required resources that Berlin didn't have. Concrete for bunkers and pillboxes was in short supply. Most had been diverted to submarine pens and Atlantic wall fortifications earlier in the war. Steel for tank barriers was similarly scarce. German engineers improvised, using rubble from bombed buildings to create obstacles, overturning trolley cars to block streets, even filling furniture vans with concrete and positioning them at intersections. The result looked impressive to civilians walking past. To military engineers, it looked like what it was: desperation dressed up as defense. The human component of the defense was even more problematic than the physical fortifications. Berlin's garrison in February 1945 consisted of approximately 90,000 Volkssturm members, 45,000 Hitler Youth, 35,000 regular Wehrmacht troops, and perhaps 10,000 SS personnel. The regular army troops were primarily from training units, convalescent hospitals, and rear area services cooks, clerks, mechanics. Very few were frontline infantry. The SS troops were more capable, but even they were spread thin. This left the Volkssturm as the primary defensive force. These men ranged in age from 16 to 60, though many were older. They had civilian jobs, teachers, shopkeepers, factory workers, clerks. Most had received only basic military training during mandatory service years earlier. Now they were issued armbands, given rifles, and told to defend their city. Otto Braun, a 54-year-old postal worker, later described his Volkssturm training. We had 3 Sunday afternoon sessions. The first session, they showed us how to load and fire the rifle. The second session, we practiced throwing dummy grenades. The third session, they gave us Panzerfausts and explained that you aim at the tank's tracks, fire, and then run very fast. That was the extent of our preparation to fight the Red Army. The Hitler Youth presented a different sort of problem. Unlike the reluctant Volkssturm, many Hitler Youth members were eager to fight. They had been raised on Nazi propaganda, had spent years in youth organizations that emphasized sacrifice and martial values. They genuinely believed in the cause. This made them simultaneously more effective and more vulnerable than older defenders. A 15-year-old boy convinced of his own righteousness will take risks that a 50-year-old with a family won't take. Heinrich Böll, who would later become a famous novelist, spent time training Hitler Youth units in February 1945. He recalled, "They were children playing at war, except the war was real. You could show them how to operate a Panzerfaust, and they'd master it in minutes, quick reflexes, no fear. But they had no tactical sense, no understanding of when to fight and when to withdraw. They'd see a Soviet tank and run toward it like it was a game, not realizing they were committing suicide." By March, approximately 2,000 Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons had been distributed to Hitler Youth units across Berlin. Each weapon was a single-shot rocket-propelled grenade capable of destroying any tank in the world. Each weapon also required getting within 30 meters of that tank, well within range of its machine guns. The fortification effort consumed thousands of man-hours that might have been better spent evacuating civilians or stockpiling supplies. But the work continued, driven partly by military necessity and partly by psychology. As long as people were building defenses, they could maintain hope that those defenses might actually work. German engineers and Volkssturm units dug anti-tank ditches through parks and residential neighborhoods. They blew up buildings to create clear fields of fire. They positioned anti-aircraft guns in underground emplacements, transforming them into anti-tank weapons. They created barriers from overturned trolleys, concrete-filled trucks, and rubble. They fortified apartment buildings, cutting firing slits into walls, sandbagging windows, preparing basements as defensive positions. The Tiergarten, Berlin's Central Park, was transformed into a maze of trenches and gun positions. The zoo's walls were reinforced to serve as barriers. Even the Landwehr Canal, running through the southern part of the city, was incorporated into the defensive plan. Engineers prepared explosives to blow bridges and create water obstacles. None of this could stop the Red Army. At best, it might slow them down. One of the most controversial aspects of Berlin's defense was the plan to use the city's extensive U-Bahn and S-Bahn tunnel systems. German military engineers recognized that these tunnels could serve multiple purposes, as shelter for civilians during bombardment, as protected routes for troop movement, and in an extreme scenario, as barriers if flooded. In March, engineers tested the floodgates that could seal off sections of the tunnel system. The tests worked perfectly. Close the gates, open the valves, and millions of gallons of water from the Spree River and Landwehr Canal would fill the tunnels, creating an impenetrable barrier to any advancing enemy. The plan had one enormous flaw: thousands of civilians sheltered in those tunnels. Flooding them would mean drowning German civilians to slow the Soviet advance. When junior officers questioned this plan, they were told that civilians would be warned and evacuated before any flooding occurred. But no one explained how such an evacuation would happen during active combat. The flood plan remained in place, a loaded gun pointed at Berlin's own population. By late March, Berlin's fortifications were as complete as they would ever be. What had been accomplished? 400 concrete pillboxes and bunkers had been constructed, though most were small and poorly positioned. Anti-tank ditches had been dug, though heavy rain had caused many to collapse or fill with water. Tank barriers had been erected at major intersections, though they channeled traffic in ways that would prove advantageous to attackers as much as defenders. The 9 defensive rings existed, though only the inner 3 had anything approaching comprehensive fortification. Artillery had been positioned, though ammunition stocks were dangerously low. And 90,000 Volkssturm men had been mobilized, armed, and assigned to positions they didn't understand, to fight a battle most of them wanted no part of. Colonel Barenfänger, studying his maps one final time before the Soviet assault began, understood the reality. Berlin's defenses would hold for perhaps a week, maybe 2 if the Soviets were cautious. After that, the city would fall. The only question was how many people would die in the interim. The tragedy of Berlin's fortification was not just military but moral. Enormous effort and resources were expended to create defenses that everyone privately knew were inadequate. Men who should have been evacuating their families instead dug trenches. Concrete that could have reinforced bomb shelters instead went into pillboxes. Weapons that might have been used to cover retreating troops instead armed children. The whole enterprise rested on a lie, the lie that Berlin could be held, that victory was still possible, that sacrifice would be rewarded. Hitler demanded this lie be maintained to the end. His generals, afraid to contradict him, maintained it. And ordinary Berliners, having been lied to for so long, no longer knew what to believe. So they picked up shovels and rifles and Panzerfausts. They built their fortress of sand, and they waited for the wave to hit. The pause at the Oder, those 2 months between the end of the Vistula-Oder offensive and the beginning of the Berlin operation, would later be debated endlessly by historians. Could Soviet forces have taken Berlin in February if they'd pushed immediately? Probably. The city was defenseless, the Wehrmacht shattered. But Zhukov and Konev needed time to regroup, resupply, and plan. That time gave Berlin its fortifications, inadequate as they were. It gave Hitler youth members training with Panzerfausts. It gave civilians 2 more months of relatively normal life before the nightmare began. Was the pause merciful or cruel? Both, perhaps. It's easier to endure sudden catastrophe than slow approaching doom. The people of Berlin spent February and March watching their city transform into a fortress, knowing that fortresses are built to be besieged, knowing that sieges end only one way. They built their defenses. They prepared, they hoped, and they waited for April. March 28, 1945. The Kremlin. Joseph Stalin sits at the head of a conference table, smoking his pipe, studying 2 men who have spent 4 years fighting his war. On his right sits Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commander of the 1st Belarusian Front, the army group positioned directly east of Berlin. On his left sits Marshal Ivan Konev, commander of the 1st Ukrainian Front, positioned southeast of the capital. Both men are exhausted. Both have earned their positions through brutal competence. Both assume they've been summoned to coordinate the final assault on Berlin. They're partially correct. Stalin does want to discuss Berlin's capture. But he has another agenda, one that will turn the fall of Berlin into a race and cost thousands of unnecessary lives. Stalin taps his pipe against the table and looks at his marshals. The Western Allies, he says slowly, may attempt to capture Berlin before us. We cannot allow this. The statement hangs in the air. Both marshals know it's nonsense. American and British forces are 200 kilometers from Berlin, still fighting on the Rhine. The Soviets are 60 kilometers away with overwhelming force. But when Stalin speaks, you don't contradict. You nod and ask how quickly he wants the impossible accomplished. The historical context of Stalin's paranoia is important. By March 1945, the Grand Alliance was fraying. The Soviet Union and the Western democracies had cooperated out of necessity. Hitler threatened them all. But with Nazi Germany collapsing, the alliance's foundation was crumbling. Disagreements emerged over Poland's future government, over occupation zones in Germany, over post-war territorial arrangements. Stalin trusted neither Churchill nor Roosevelt. He believed correctly, as it happens, that Western leaders would prefer a post-war Europe without Soviet domination. Therefore, every action became competitive. Whoever occupied territory at war's end would control it afterward. If American forces took Berlin, they would control Germany's capital and, by extension, Germany's future government. Stalin could not permit this. The fact that Western leaders had no intention of pushing for Berlin, Eisenhower had explicitly told Stalin as much, didn't matter. Stalin had survived Soviet politics by assuming everyone was an enemy until proven otherwise. He would not gamble the Soviet Union's security on Western promises. The military situation on March 28th strongly favored Soviet capture of Berlin. Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front, positioned on the Oder River, numbered 8,500 men, 3,300 tanks, and 17,000 artillery pieces. Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front added another 550,900 men, 1,500 tanks, and 13,000 guns. Together, nearly 1.5 million Soviet soldiers stood poised to attack. Facing them, German forces could muster perhaps 110,000 troops defending the Seelow Heights, and perhaps another 90,000 in Berlin itself. The numerical advantage was staggering, roughly 7-1 in troops, 12-1 in tanks, 20-1 in artillery. Yet Stalin wasn't satisfied with this overwhelming superiority. He wanted Berlin quickly by May 1st, International Workers' Day, when the Soviet Union traditionally celebrated with massive military parades. Imagine the propaganda value of announcing Berlin's capture on that date. The symbolism would be perfect. But May 1st was only 33 days away. Could Zhukov and Konev plan and execute the largest urban assault in history in barely a month? Stalin's method of motivating his marshals was characteristically devious. Rather than simply ordering them to cooperate, he set them against each other. He spread the map across the table and drew the boundary between their fronts with a red pencil. The line ran north-south, directly to Lubin, a town southeast of Berlin. Then Stalin stopped drawing. After Lubin, he said, looking at both marshals, whoever reaches Berlin first will take it. The implications were obvious. The boundary was deliberately ambiguous. Both fronts could legitimately claim the right to attack the capital. Stalin had just turned the battle for Berlin into a competition. Zhukov, whose front had direct responsibility for the Berlin Axis, felt his stomach tighten. Konev, seeing an opportunity to outmaneuver his rival, leaned forward with interest. Stalin watched both men carefully. He had no interest in military efficiency or minimizing casualties. He wanted speed, glory, and two ambitious commanders who would drive their men mercilessly to be first into Hitler's capital. If soldiers died because of duplicated effort, hasty planning, or reckless assaults, well, that was unfortunate but acceptable. The Soviet Union had plenty of soldiers. It had only one chance to capture Berlin at the perfect symbolic moment. What Stalin knew but didn't tell his marshals was that the Western Allies posed no real threat to Soviet plans. On March 28th, Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in the West, sent a direct telegram to Stalin outlining Allied intentions. American and British forces would advance toward Dresden and Leipzig, linking up with Soviet forces in central Germany. Berlin, Eisenhower explained, was no longer a military objective. It was too far from Allied lines, would cost too many casualties to capture, and wasn't strategically necessary since Germany was already beaten. Churchill was furious with Eisenhower's decision, arguing that political considerations should override purely military ones. But Eisenhower held firm. American and British soldiers would not die for a city that Stalin wanted and that held no military value. Eisenhower's telegram should have ended Stalin's anxiety about a race for Berlin. Instead, Stalin pocketed the information and said nothing to Zhukov or Konev. Why? Because the fiction of Western competition served his purposes. It motivated his commanders. It justified the rush timeline. And it provided political cover. If the assault proved more costly than expected, he could claim he had no choice but to attack quickly. The logistical challenge of mounting an offensive in 33 days was enormous. Zhukov and Konev needed to move millions of tons of supplies forward, repair or replace damaged equipment, reconnoiter German defenses, plan attack routes through urban terrain, and coordinate with artillery and air support. Normal military planning for an operation of this scale required months. Stalin was giving them weeks. Both marshals returned to their headquarters and immediately began working 18-hour days. Supply trains moved continuously toward the front, carrying shells, fuel, food, and replacement equipment. Engineers repaired bridges over the Oder, built new roads capable of handling heavy tank traffic, and stockpiled bridging equipment for crossing Berlin's rivers and canals. Infantry units trained in urban warfare tactics, practicing assault techniques in ruined Polish villages. Artillery officers calculated firing tables for bombardments of unprecedented scale. The Red Army machine, honed by 4 years of total war, shifted into maximum effort. It was an impressive display of military organization. It was also desperately rushed. Shortcuts were taken. Equipment was fielded without adequate testing. Soldiers received abbreviated training. Plans were drawn up and implemented without time for review, all to meet Stalin's May 1st deadline. The rivalry between Zhukov and Konev added another layer of complexity. These were not friends or allies coordinating toward a shared goal. They were competitors locked in a zero-sum contest. Zhukov was the senior marshal, the celebrated marshal of victory who had saved Moscow, broken the siege of Leningrad, and smashed German forces at Kursk. He expected to command the Berlin assault and receive the glory. Konev was younger, equally capable, and deeply resented always playing second fiddle to Zhukov. Now, Stalin had given him a chance to eclipse his rival. Konev pored over maps, looking for any approach that would get his troops into Berlin faster than Zhukov's. He noticed that Zhukov would have to cross the Oder River under fire, then assault the Silo Heights, a natural fortress that would slow any advance. Konev's sector, farther south, faced less formidable terrain. If he could break through quickly and wheel north, he might reach Berlin first. It was risky, turning an entire front 90 degrees while advancing is complicated even under ideal circumstances, but the potential reward was enormous. Konev began planning an approach that would bypass Zhukov's front entirely and strike Berlin from an unexpected direction. By mid-April, everything was in position. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 6,250 tanks, 41,600 artillery pieces, and 7,500 aircraft prepared for the final assault. The numbers represented the culmination of Soviet military buildup, the Red Army, at its absolute peak strength and capability. Never before and never again would the Soviet Union assemble such concentrated combat power. The logistical achievement was staggering. Just keeping this force fed required delivering thousands of tons of food daily. Ammunition stocks included millions of shells. Fuel depots held enough gasoline and diesel to move the entire force hundreds of kilometers. Medical services prepared for tens of thousands of casualties. Everything that vast industrial mobilization, captured equipment from defeated enemies, and Lend-Lease aid from America could provide had been concentrated on one objective: Berlin. The city's defenders numbered perhaps 200,000, many of them elderly men and children. The outcome was never in doubt. The only questions were when Berlin would fall and which Soviet marshal would claim the victory. On April 15th, Zhukov and Konev held simultaneous final briefings with their subordinate commanders. The men who would actually lead the assaults, the division commanders, the tank brigade leaders, the artillery chiefs, learned the full scope of what was planned. Many were shocked by the timeline. Attack in 36 hours, through fortified positions, against an enemy that would fight fanatically because they were defending their own capital. The casualty estimates were grim. Some officers raised tactical objections. They were told that Stalin had ordered Berlin's capture by May 1st, and that political considerations overrode tactical concerns. What did this mean in practice? It meant that if an assault was failing, you didn't pause to reconsider you committed more troops. It meant accepting casualties that careful planning might have avoided. It meant choosing speed over safety, symbolism over strategy. When junior officers asked why the rush, after all, Germany was beaten, the war essentially won. Senior officers couldn't answer honestly. How do you explain that thousands of men will die in the next 2 weeks because Stalin wants to announce Berlin's capture on International Workers' Day? You don't. You simply tell them that orders are orders, that victory is close, that history will remember their sacrifice, and you hope they're too tired or too disciplined to ask follow-up questions. The cost of Stalin's manufactured race would be calculated in bodies. Over the next 2 weeks, approximately 80,000 Soviet soldiers would die capturing Berlin. Thousands more would die because two fronts, instead of cooperating efficiently, competed to be first to symbolic objectives. Units would duplicate efforts, leave gaps in coverage, and take unnecessary risks because of unclear boundaries between Zhukov's and Konev's areas of responsibility. Near firefights would occur between Soviet troops who mistook each other for enemies in the confusion of urban combat, all because Stalin wanted Berlin by May 1st and wanted his marshals competing rather than cooperating. When Zhukov, decades later, was asked if the Berlin operation could have been executed differently, he gave a carefully worded answer. "We did what was necessary given the political requirements at the time." Read between the lines, and the answer becomes clear. Militarily, the Berlin operation was unnecessarily costly. Politically, it was exactly what Stalin ordered. And in the Soviet Union, political requirements always trumped military efficiency. The race for Berlin was about to begin. The soldiers assembling on the Oder River, checking their weapons and writing last letters home, didn't know they were participating in a competition. They thought they were simply going to finish the war. They would learn otherwise in the rubble of the Silo Heights. April 14th, 1945. General Gotthard Heinrici stands on the Silo Heights, 48 meters above the Oder River floodplain, and watches the Soviet army prepare to kill him. Through binoculars, he can see them across the river, endless columns of trucks, tanks moving into position, artillery being dug in and camouflaged. The Soviets aren't even trying to hide their preparations anymore. They know they have overwhelming force. They know the outcome is inevitable. But Heinrici isn't looking at the big picture. He's studying terrain, calculating angles, measuring distances. The heights are his last advantage, perhaps Germany's last advantage. This escarpment, this natural fortress, carved by ancient glaciers, gives defenders a commanding view, and attacking infantry an exhausting climb under fire. It's not enough to win, but it might be enough to delay. And delay is all Heinrici has left to offer. He's Germany's finest defensive specialist, the general who spent 3 years conducting brilliant retreats on the Eastern Front, trading space for time and inflicting maximum casualties on advancing Soviets. Now he has no more space to trade. The next defensive line is Berlin itself. Heinrici lowers his binoculars and begins calculating how many hours he can buy with how many lives. Heinrici was an unusual choice for defending Berlin, precisely because he was competent. Most capable German generals had been dismissed, demoted, or executed by 1945. Hitler preferred loyalists over professionals, true believers over tactical geniuses. But even Hitler recognized that the Oder River line required someone who understood defensive warfare. Heinrici had earned his reputation through 3 years of brutal combat. While other German commanders wasted divisions in futile counterattacks, Heinrici perfected the art of the fighting withdrawal. He understood that defensive warfare is mathematics. You calculate how long you can hold a position, extract maximum casualties from the enemy during that period, and retreat before being encircled. Repeat endlessly. It wasn't glorious, but it worked. At Army Group Center, Heinrici had turned what should have been catastrophic defeats into orderly retreats that preserved his forces. Now, commanding Army Group Vistula, he faced his ultimate challenge: defending the Silo Heights with barely 100,000 troops against more than 900,000 Soviets. The mathematics were brutally simple. He couldn't win, but he could make them pay for every meter. The Silo Heights themselves were the product of geological accident. During the last ice age, glaciers had carved the Oder Valley, leaving behind an escarpment on the western bank. The heights rose 48 meters above the surrounding floodplain, not a massive cliff, but steep enough to channel attackers and exhaust infantry climbing under full combat load. More importantly, the heights provided perfect observation. From the top, German artillery observers could see across the entire Oder floodplain. Soviet troops assembling for attack would be visible kilometers away. Every movement could be tracked, every concentration targeted. The heights were a natural fortress, and Heinrici intended to exploit every advantage they offered. His engineers had been preparing positions for weeks. Artillery was dug in on the reverse slope, invisible to Soviet observation, but positioned to fire on pre-planned coordinates across the floodplain. Machine gun nests were camouflaged in ruins of villages. Anti-tank guns were positioned in defilade, waiting for Soviet armor to expose itself. Heinrici had even ordered the Oder floodplain deliberately flooded, turning the lowland into swamp that would bog down tanks and force infantry into predictable channels. But Heinrici's genius lay not in his defensive preparations, but in his willingness to disobey Hitler. Nazi doctrine demanded that every position be held to the last man, no retreat, no withdrawal, fight until death or capture. This doctrine had destroyed countless German divisions, trapped in indefensible positions by orders that forbade sensible retreat. Heinrici recognized that blind obedience was suicide, so he planned a different approach. He would defend the Silo Heights with 3 defensive lines, each spaced 8 kilometers apart. The front line closest to the Oder would be lightly held. When Soviet artillery began its inevitable massive bombardment, most German troops would be in the second and third lines, safely beyond the barrage. The front line troops would withdraw as soon as the bombardment lifted, leaving the Soviets to capture empty trenches while the real battle began kilometers to the rear. This elastic defense violated Hitler's standing orders. If discovered, Heinrich would probably be relieved of command, possibly executed. But Heinrich had made his calculation. Better to be shot by his own side while achieving something than to waste his army following suicidal orders that served no purpose. The forces at Heinrich's disposal were scraped together from the wreckage of the Eastern Front. He commanded elements of the Ninth Army, approximately 110,000 troops on paper, perhaps 70,000 combat-effective soldiers in reality. These weren't the elite divisions that had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. Those men were dead, captured, or had retreated deep into Germany. Heinrich's army consisted of remnants, reinforcements, and rear area troops pressed into frontline service. He had 512 tanks, but many were immobile, used as static pillboxes because they lacked fuel or spare parts. His artillery numbered 2,625 guns, impressive until compared to Soviet forces preparing to attack. Ammunition was rationed 30 shells per gun per day, barely enough for sustained combat. Fuel was so scarce that tanks were positioned and told to remain in place until the battle began. Food supplies were adequate for perhaps 2 weeks. After that, soldiers would be eating their boot leather. These were the tools Heinrich had to work with. Not an army, really. More like an armed mob with delusions of organization. The German soldiers occupying the Silo Heights understood their situation better than their commanders admitted. Hans von Luck, a panzer commander whose unit was positioned on the heights, later wrote about the atmosphere during those final days before the assault. There was no illusions anymore, he recalled. We knew the war was lost. We knew Berlin would fall. Most of us just wanted to survive long enough to surrender to the Americans or British rather than the Russians. But we had our orders, and strangely, that provided comfort. We didn't have to think about the big questions: should Germany surrender? Could the war be prolonged? Was there any point to continued resistance? Someone else made those decisions. We just had to hold the heights for as long as possible, inflict maximum casualties, and try not to die. It sounds strange, but there was relief in having such clear, simple objectives. The strategic situation was chaos. The tactical situation was straightforward. Shoot Russians, don't get shot, retreat when ordered. Heinrich's defensive doctrine emphasized flexibility and initiative at lower command levels. He couldn't personally direct a battle that would span dozens of kilometers and involve hundreds of engagements simultaneously. So he gave his subordinate commanders unusual authority: hold positions as long as feasible, withdraw before being overrun, preserve your forces. This was revolutionary in the Wehrmacht of 1945, where initiative was usually punished and blind obedience rewarded. But Heinrich understood that the old ways had failed. Germany was losing because tactical flexibility had been strangled by strategic rigidity. If he was going to delay the Soviet advance, and delay was his only achievable objective, he needed officers who could think, adapt, and make decisions without waiting for orders from above. Some of Heinrich's fellow generals considered this approach dangerously close to defeatism. They were probably right, but defeatism that kept soldiers alive and fighting another day was more useful than fanaticism that wasted them for no gain. The psychological state of German defenders mixed fatalism, determination, and desperate hope. Fatalism, because the outcome was obvious: the Soviets would eventually break through, Berlin would fall, Germany would surrender. Determination, because soldiers had been fighting for years and couldn't simply stop because the end was near. And desperate hope, the irrational but powerful belief that somehow, impossibly, things might still work out. Maybe the alliance between Soviets and Western democracies would collapse, leading to a separate peace. Maybe German scientists would complete a wonder weapon that changed everything. Maybe. These fantasies kept soldiers going when rational calculation would have led to immediate surrender. The men digging positions on the Silo Heights knew intellectually that they were defending a lost cause, but emotionally, they couldn't fully accept it. So, they dug trenches, cleaned weapons, wrote letters to families they would probably never see again, and prepared to fight because the alternative, accepting utter defeat, was psychologically impossible. On April 15th, the night before the assault, Heinrich visited forward positions. He wanted to see conditions firsthand, wanted to speak with soldiers who would bear the initial Soviet attack. What he found was better than expected. Despite everything, despite the approaching defeat, the overwhelming odds, the knowledge that Berlin itself was doomed, morale remained surprisingly solid. Not enthusiastic, certainly not optimistic, but determined. These men would fight. Not because they believed in Hitler anymore, not because they thought Germany would win, but because they were soldiers, and this was their job. Heinrich shook hands, shared cigarettes, offered quiet words of encouragement. He didn't lie to them. He didn't promise victory or claim the heights could be held indefinitely. He simply told them that their job was to make the Soviets pay dearly, to buy time for civilians to evacuate from Berlin, to extract whatever advantage could be extracted from a bad situation. The soldiers appreciated the honesty. They were tired of propaganda, tired of speeches about final victory and wonder weapons. Heinrich's quiet competence was more reassuring than any amount of theatrical rhetoric. That night, as Heinrich returned to his command post, he reviewed the situation one final time. The Silo Heights gave him advantages: observation, elevation, prepared defenses. His elastic defense doctrine would allow him to survive the initial Soviet bombardment. His troops, while outnumbered, were defending familiar ground, but none of this changed the fundamental equation. Zhukov commanded 900,000 troops to Heinrich's 110,000. Soviet artillery outnumbered German guns 20-1. Soviet tanks could replace losses, German tanks could not. Best case scenario, Heinrich delays the Soviet advance for 3 to 5 days before being forced to retreat toward Berlin. Worst case, his entire army is encircled and destroyed in the first 48 hours. Heinrich calculated that he could probably manage something in between, a fighting withdrawal that extracted maximum Soviet casualties, while preserving enough German forces to defend Berlin's outskirts. It wasn't much, but it was something, and at this stage of the war, something was all that remained. The Silo Heights were Germany's last natural defensive position before Berlin. After the heights fell and they would fall, the road to the capital lay open across flat terrain, perfect for tank warfare. The heights were the cork in the bottle. Once removed, nothing could stop the flood. Heinrich understood this perfectly. So did his soldiers. So did the Soviet forces preparing to attack. Everyone knew what was coming. The only questions were how long it would take and how many would die answering those questions. On the Soviet side of the Oder, Zhukov made his final preparations, confident that overwhelming force would shatter German defenses within hours. On the German side, Heinrich checked his maps one last time, adjusted his defensive plans, and prepared to prove Zhukov wrong. Not by stopping the Soviet advance that was impossible, but by making it so costly, so difficult, so bloody that Zhukov would remember the Silo Heights for the rest of his life. In the end, that's what defensive warfare reduces to when strategic victory is impossible, making your enemy pay such a price that even his victory feels like defeat. The stage was set, the armies were positioned, and in just a few hours, the largest battle on German soil would begin. 3 a.m., April 16, 1945. Soviet engineers throw switches, and suddenly night becomes day. 143 anti-aircraft searchlights, repositioned for ground warfare, blaze to life simultaneously. The beams illuminate the Oder floodplain, turning darkness into a brilliant, artificial noon. The effect is supposed to blind German defenders, while allowing Soviet troops to advance under light. Instead, the searchlights create a grotesque theater of war. Fog and smoke from earlier bombardment scatter the light, transforming the battlefield into a glowing white void. Soviet infantry, advancing across the floodplain, become silhouettes against the blinding glare, perfect targets for German gunners on the heights above. Machine guns open fire, mortars begin dropping shells, and Soviet troops, who expected to attack under advantage, instead find themselves illuminated, like actors on a stage, while an invisible audience shoots at them from the darkness beyond the lights. Within minutes, hundreds are dead. Within an hour, thousands. And the assault has barely begun. This is the Battle of the Silo Heights, Zhukov's attempt to break through to Berlin in a single overwhelming blow. It will become one of the bloodiest days in military history. The plan had seemed sound during war room briefings. Zhukov knew that German defenders on the heights had excellent observation during daylight. Night attacks would be difficult to coordinate. So, his staff suggested using searchlights to create artificial daylight that would blind the Germans, while allowing Soviet troops to see. The idea was creative, perhaps even brilliant. There was just one problem. Nobody tested it under combat conditions. When the lights switched on at 3 a.m., they revealed that fog and artillery smoke don't behave like clear air. Light doesn't cut through fog, it reflects off it, creating a glowing haze that obscures more than it reveals. The German defenders, positioned higher up the escarpment, looked down into this glowing fog and could easily see Soviet troops silhouetted against it. Meanwhile, Soviet infantry trying to advance could barely see 10 meters in any direction. Tactical communications broke down immediately. Unit commanders lost contact with their troops. Soldiers became disoriented, sometimes firing at their own units. The searchlights, intended to provide advantage, became a catastrophic liability. But Zhukov's attack plan had already begun, and Soviet military doctrine didn't allow for rapid improvisation. The assault would continue as planned, searchlights be damned. 2 hours before the searchlights activated, Soviet artillery had opened fire. This wasn't just a bombardment, it was an attempt to obliterate German defenses through sheer volume of explosives. 9,000 artillery pieces and mortars fired simultaneously. The sound was beyond description. Survivors on both sides later struggled to find words adequate to convey the experience. It wasn't merely loud, it was physically oppressive, a pressure that compressed your chest and made breathing difficult. The ground shook constantly. Structures collapsed from vibration alone, even without direct hits. The barrage lasted 30 minutes and consumed 1.2 million shells. That's one shell for every 4 meters of front line. The intention was to destroy German defenses so thoroughly that Soviet infantry would advance through ruins occupied only by corpses and shell-shocked survivors. It would have worked too, except for one problem. Heinrici had withdrawn most of his troops from the front line the previous night. The Soviet bombardment fell on largely empty trenches, killing only the skeleton force left behind. By the time Soviet infantry advanced at 5 a.m., German defenders had reoccupied prepared positions in the second defensive line and were waiting. The initial Soviet assault involved 7 rifle divisions and multiple tank brigades, roughly 100,000 men and 500 tanks attacking on a front of just 25 kilometers. The density of forces was extraordinary, nearly 4,000 men per kilometer of front. This concentration should have guaranteed breakthrough. Instead, it created chaos. Too many units competing for too little space. Traffic jams developed as tanks tried to navigate through infantry formations. Artillery support couldn't engage targets without risking friendly fire on the densely packed troops. And the Oder floodplain, deliberately flooded by German engineers, turned into a muddy swamp that bogged down vehicles and exhausted infantry. Soviet soldiers advanced into the glowing fog created by the searchlights, sinking ankle-deep in mud, carrying full combat loads of weapons and ammunition. They moved slowly, painfully, toward an enemy they couldn't see clearly. German machine gunners on the heights, looking down, had no such problems. They simply aimed into the densest concentrations of silhouettes and fired until their barrels overheated. The killing was mechanized, impersonal, horrifyingly efficient. By 7 a.m., Soviet losses were already catastrophic. Advance elements had reached the base of the Silo Heights, a gain of perhaps 8 kilometers, but at enormous cost. Entire companies had been annihilated crossing the floodplain. Tank units reported 50% losses, vehicles destroyed by German anti-tank guns firing from concealed positions. Medical services were overwhelmed, unable to evacuate wounded under continued artillery fire. Command posts struggled to maintain communication with forward units. And the real battle, the assault up the heights themselves, hadn't even begun. Zhukov, monitoring reports from his command bunker, realized with growing fury that his carefully planned breakthrough was failing. The searchlights had backfired. The artillery bombardment had missed its targets. German defenses remained intact. And Soviet forces, instead of racing toward Berlin, were dying in a swamp under the guns of an enemy that was supposed to have been neutralized. At 2 p.m., Zhukov made a fateful decision. He committed his armor reserves early, ordering tank armies forward that were supposed to exploit the breakthrough once infantry secured the heights. Now they would have to fight for every meter. The commitment of Soviet armor transformed the battle from infantry assault to mechanized slugging match. IS-2 heavy tanks and 34 mediums ground up the slopes of the Silo heights, engines screaming, treads churning mud and grass. German anti-tank gunners had been waiting for this moment. They allowed the tanks to advance into killing zones, let them expose their vulnerable side armor while navigating steep slopes, then opened fire at point-blank range. 88mm guns, the legendary German anti-tank weapons, methodically destroyed Soviet armor. One gun crew knocked out 11 tanks before being silenced by artillery. Another destroyed 14 before Soviet infantry overran their position. But for every gun crew neutralized, others kept firing. Soviet tank losses mounted geometrically. Burning vehicles blocked routes that following tanks needed to use. Smoke from destroyed armor obscured the battlefield, complicating Soviet coordination. And still the tanks came, wave after wave, because Zhukov had ordered Berlin taken quickly, and quickly meant accepting losses that careful planning might have avoided. By afternoon, Heinrich's elastic defense was working exactly as planned. German frontline units, lightly engaged during the initial bombardment, had withdrawn to prepared positions. Soviet forces advancing through empty frontline trenches suddenly encountered the real German defense at the second line, fresh troops in well-prepared positions, with clear fields of fire. The battle devolved into dozens of separate engagements along the heights. Soviet infantry would assault a village, suffer terrible casualties, clearing it building by building, only to come under fire from the next village. German defenders would hold a position until nearly overrun, then retreat to another prepared position 500 meters back. The result was that Soviet forces advanced slowly, painfully, but never achieved the clean breakthrough that Zhukov's plan required. Every meter was contested, every position had to be cleared, and the casualties mounted with horrifying arithmetic. By 6 p.m., Soviet medical units had already treated over 15,000 wounded. The actual death toll was impossible to calculate amid the ongoing battle, but estimates suggested 10,000 dead or missing. This was in a single day, on a front just 25 kilometers wide. The mathematics of attrition were working in Germany's favor, even as Germany lost ground. The psychological impact on Soviet troops was profound. These soldiers had fought across 2,000 kilometers of Soviet territory, across Poland, across East Prussia. They had seen their homeland devastated, their cities destroyed, their people murdered by German occupation. They expected to take Berlin, expected revenge, expected victory. Now they were dying in a muddy swamp, for gains measured in meters. Morale began cracking. Some units refused orders to advance until commissars threatened summary execution. Others charged forward with suicidal determination, trying to end the battle through sheer willpower. Neither approach worked. German defenders had the advantage of terrain and prepared positions. Soviet numerical superiority meant little when attackers could only advance on narrow fronts that concentrated them into target-rich environments for German gunners. By nightfall, Soviet forces had gained perhaps 12 kilometers and reached the crest of the Silo Heights in a few places. But the breakthrough hadn't happened. German defenses remained intact. And Zhukov's schedule, Berlin by May 1st, suddenly looked impossible. At 11 p.m., Zhukov arrived personally at the front to assess the situation. His staff tried to shield him from the worst news, but the evidence was overwhelming. 30,000 casualties on the first day, 743 tanks destroyed or immobilized, multiple divisions shattered and unable to continue attacks without rest and reinforcement. The Silo Heights, supposed to fall in hours, remained contested after 18 hours of continuous combat. German forces had retreated, yes, but in good order, maintaining defensive coherence. Stalin would be furious. Konev, attacking farther south, was reportedly making better progress and would certainly use Zhukov's difficulties to argue for greater command authority. Zhukov's reputation earned through 4 years of brilliant victories faced its greatest test. He could acknowledge the failure of his initial plan, regroup, and attack more carefully tomorrow. Or he could double down, commit everything available, and batter through German defenses through sheer weight of numbers. Zhukov chose violence. He ordered fresh divisions forward, committed additional artillery, and told his commanders that the Silo Heights must fall tomorrow regardless of cost. Victory would justify the casualties. Failure would be unacceptable. The first day of the Silo Heights battle revealed fundamental truths about warfare that planning often obscures. Clever tactics like searchlights could backfire catastrophically when environmental conditions weren't properly considered. Overwhelming numerical superiority could be negated by terrain and defensive preparation. Carefully constructed timetables could collapse when the enemy refused to cooperate by dying on schedule. And the mathematics of attrition, while ultimately favoring the larger force, could extract such terrible costs that victory felt indistinguishable from defeat. Soviet forces would eventually break through. That outcome was never in doubt. The Red Army could replace its losses. Germany could not. But the question wasn't whether the Soviets would win, but what that victory would cost, and whether the cost was necessary. As soldiers on both sides tried to sleep amid the sounds of wounded screaming and ammunition being brought forward, they understood that tomorrow would be worse. The battle had just begun. The Silo Heights would not fall easily, and Stalin's May 1st deadline, once seemingly achievable, now looked like a death sentence for anyone standing between Zhukov's army and Berlin. April 17th, dawn. The artillery begins again, not the massive barrage of yesterday, but something more surgical. Soviet forward observers, having identified surviving German positions during yesterday's fighting, now direct fire with precision. Shells land on specific buildings, specific tree lines, specific intersections where German defenders have concentrated. This is the Red Army learning from its mistakes, adapting tactics in real time. The indiscriminate carpet bombing of April 16th is replaced by targeted destruction. But German defenders are also adapting. Heinrich's order goes out. No position is worth a division. Fight, inflict casualties, withdraw before encirclement. It's a race now. Can Soviet forces break through before German forces escape? Can Zhukov achieve his breakthrough while Heinrich preserves his army? The answer will be written in blood across the next 72 hours. The Silo Heights, which should have fallen in a day, will require 3 days of continuous combat to secure. And by the end, both sides will have paid prices that should have been unacceptable. Should have been. But this is 1945, and acceptability is measured differently when the war's end is visible but not yet reached. The German defense on April 17th showed signs of strain that weren't evident the day before. Ammunition stockpiles were running critically low. Artillery units, which had fired freely on the 16th, were now rationed to 3 shells per gun per hour. Machine gun teams were told to fire only at confirmed targets, conserving ammunition for close-range defense. Anti-tank guns had destroyed hundreds of Soviet vehicles on the first day, but were running out of armor-piercing shells. Some gun crews resorted to firing high-explosive shells at Soviet infantry, less effective than proper anti-tank rounds against armor. But the only ammunition available, medical supplies, were exhausted. Wounded soldiers were treated with field dressings and sent back to fight because there were no vehicles to evacuate them and no hospitals with capacity to receive them. Food supplies were adequate but poorly distributed. Some units were eating cold rations while others had nothing. The German military machine, once famous for its logistical efficiency, was now held together by improvisation and prayers. Soviet forces, meanwhile, were implementing lessons learned from the disastrous first day. The searchlights were shut down. Whatever theoretical advantage they provided wasn't worth the practical disadvantage of silhouetting attackers. Artillery tactics shifted from massive barrages to rolling barrages that advanced ahead of infantry, clearing positions systematically. Tank tactics changed too. Instead of sending armor up the heights in mass formations, Soviet commanders began using tanks in small groups to support infantry assaults on specific strongpoints. This was slower but more effective. A squad of infantry would pin down German defenders, while a single tank maneuvered for a clear shot, destroying the position with direct fire. Then the combined group would advance to the next objective. It wasn't the breakthrough Zhukov wanted, it was grinding, attritional warfare. But it worked. German positions fell one by one. The line on the map moved westward, slowly but inexorably. The battle for Silo town itself exemplified the new pattern of combat. The town sat on the heights' forward slope, a collection of perhaps 200 buildings that the Germans had fortified extensively. Every major structure was a strong point. Cellars were turned into bunkers. Upper floors became firing positions. Alleys were barricaded and mined. The town's defenders, about 500 men from various Wehrmacht units, prepared to sell their lives expensively. On the morning of April 17th, Soviet infantry, supported by engineers and flamethrower teams, began clearing the town building by building. The process was methodical and brutal. Engineers would blow a hole in a building's wall. Flamethrower teams would pump burning fuel into the breach. Infantry would rush through the flames to clear survivors. Sometimes defenders fled the fire, surrendering in the streets. More often they fought from the burning building until they died from fire, smoke, or bullets. Silo town fell by evening, but clearing it cost Soviet forces 600 casualties. 500 Germans had exacted payment of 600 Soviet lives before dying or surrendering. The mathematics of attrition were working, but slowly, too slowly, for Zhukov's schedule. By April 18th, the pattern was established. German defenders would hold a position until casualties and ammunition exhaustion made continued defense impossible, then withdraw to prepared positions farther back. Soviet forces would assault, suffer casualties, capture the position, treat their wounded, bring up supplies, and prepare for the next assault. The process repeated dozens of times across the heights. Every village, every farm, every patch of woods became a battlefield. Soviet advantages in artillery and air power gradually overwhelmed German resistance, but German tactical skill and defensive preparation prevented clean breakthroughs. Heinrich's elastic defense was working exactly as designed. He was trading space for time and German lives for Soviet lives at favorable exchange rates, but the space was running out. Behind the Silo heights lay only flat terrain and Berlin. Heinrich could delay but not stop the inevitable. Every hour bought was purchased with blood. The human cost was staggering on both sides, but disproportionately fell on Soviet infantry. Tank crews and artillery personnel suffered significant casualties from German counterfire, but infantry bore the main burden. Assaulting prepared positions under fire is one of warfare's most dangerous activities. Soviet tactical doctrine emphasized momentum and aggression traits that were effective in mobile warfare, but costly in static combat. Soviet infantry units attacked repeatedly against the same objectives, suffering 50 or 60% casualties before achieving success. Junior officers, leading from the front as doctrine required, died at catastrophic rates. Some rifle companies went through 3 commanders in a single day. Soldiers who survived one assault were immediately reorganized and sent against the next objective. There was no rest, no rotation, no time to process trauma or grief. You fought until wounded, killed, or victorious. The Red Army had millions of soldiers and could accept such losses, but the psychological toll on survivors was immense. These men had fought across Eastern Europe, had seen terrible things and done terrible things. Now they were dying in sight of their ultimate objective, Berlin, visible on the horizon for every meter of muddy ground. German casualties were proportionally smaller, but strategically more significant. The Wehrmacht couldn't replace losses. Every dead soldier, every destroyed tank, every expended artillery shell was irreplaceable. German units that began the battle at 70% strength were down to 40% by April 18th. Some battalions effectively ceased to exist as organized formations, survivors amalgamated into ad hoc combat groups. Medical evacuation was nearly impossible. The few ambulances available were reserved for the most critically wounded, while others had to walk or crawl to aid stations. Burial was impossible. Bodies were left where they fell, to be dealt with after the battle, if there was an after. The psychological effect of fighting while surrounded by unburied comrades was profound. It reinforced the sense that this was the end, that no matter how well you fought or how many enemy soldiers you killed, the outcome was predetermined. Some German soldiers broke under this realization, simply walking away from their positions. Others became fatalistic and reckless, taking chances no rational person would take because life expectancy was measured in hours anyway. A few became more determined, deciding that if they were going to die, they would take as many Soviets with them as possible. On April 18th afternoon, a moment occurred that encapsulated the battle's essential character. A German Jagdpanther tank destroyer, a massive, heavily armored vehicle with an 88mm gun, was positioned in a tree line overlooking a key road. The crew, 5 men who had been fighting together since Kursk, waited as Soviet armor advanced. They held fire while 34 tanks passed, waiting for more valuable targets. An IS-2 heavy tank appeared, then another. The Jag Panther opened fire at 1,200 meters, destroying the first IS-2 with a single shot. The second heavy tank exploded before it could react. Soviet tank commanders, realizing they were under fire from a concealed position, began maneuvering for cover. But the Jag Panther's crew methodically destroyed tank after tank. 8, 10, 12 confirmed kills. Soviet infantry tried to flank the position. German machine guns cut them down. Soviet artillery began saturating the tree line with shells. The Jag Panther's crew continued firing, destroying their 14th Soviet tank at 500 meters. Then, an artillery shell landed directly on the vehicle. The explosion killed the crew instantly. Soviet forces recovered the wreck 3 hours later. 14 destroyed tanks marked a trail leading to the burnt-out Jag Panther. 5 men had held up a Soviet advance for over an hour and exacted an enormous toll. Then, they died. This was the Silo Heights in microcosm. Tactical brilliance and individual heroism that changed nothing strategically but cost attackers dearly. By April 19th morning, the German defense was collapsing not from defeat but from exhaustion and attrition. Units had been fighting continuously for 72 hours. Soldiers were literally falling asleep while standing in their foxholes. Ammunition supplies were critically low. Some artillery batteries had fewer than 10 shells remaining. Medical supplies were non-existent. Wounds were bandaged with torn uniforms, and soldiers told to keep fighting. Food was scarce. Many soldiers hadn't eaten in 24 hours. Communication with higher command was sporadic at best. Some units were fighting isolated battles, unaware that adjacent units had already withdrawn. The line was coming apart not because of Soviet breakthrough, but because the human beings holding it couldn't continue without rest, food, ammunition, and reinforcement that weren't coming. Heinrich, recognizing that catastrophic encirclement was imminent, issued the order to withdraw to Berlin's outer defenses. It was the right decision militarily. It was also the end of organized German resistance outside the capital. After April 19th, the battle would move into Berlin itself. Soviet forces reaching the crest of the Silo Heights on April 19th evening found a wasteland. Villages were reduced to rubble, trees were shattered by artillery, the ground was cratered and muddy, littered with destroyed vehicles, discarded equipment, and bodies. Thousands of bodies. The smell was overwhelming: burnt flesh, explosives, mud, death. Soviet soldiers advancing through this landscape struggled with contradictory emotions. Pride in victory, they had broken the German defense. Horror at the cost entire companies destroyed for individual buildings. Rage at the Germans for continuing to fight when defeat was inevitable. And underneath everything, exhaustion. They had been promised that breaking through Silo would end the war. Now, they understood that Silo was just the beginning. Berlin itself remained, and if defending a line of hills had cost this much, what would capturing a city of 3 million cost? No one wanted to think about that. So, they checked their weapons, shared cigarettes, wrote quick letters home, and prepared to continue. The Silo Heights had fallen, 33,000 Soviet soldiers dead, 12,000 Germans dead, 743 Soviet tanks destroyed, 200 German tanks destroyed. All for a line of hills that most people had never heard of before and would forget immediately after. But for those who fought there, the Silo Heights would never be forgotten. It was hell. And hell, it turned out, was just the entrance to something worse. April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday. The last birthday celebration of the Third Reich takes place in the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Champagne is poured. Toasts are offered. Goebbels gives a speech about final victory. And outside, 8 kilometers away, Soviet artillery shells begin falling on Berlin's eastern suburbs. The guests in the bunker can hear the distant thunder. They pretend not to notice. This is the surreal comedy of the Reich's final days, maintaining elaborate fictions even as reality crashes through the door. But Hitler's birthday party, absurd as it is, serves a purpose. While Nazi leadership celebrates underground, 3 Soviet army groups are executing the most complex military encirclement of the war. Zhukov's first Belarusian front attacks from the east. Konev's first Ukrainian front sweeps up from the south. Rokossovsky's second Belarusian front closes in from the north. The jaws of a massive trap are closing around Berlin. Within 5 days, the encirclement will be complete. 464,000 German troops and 2 million civilians will be trapped. And the last battle of the European War will enter its final, terrible phase. The strategic situation by April 20th was stark. The Silo Heights had fallen. German forces were retreating toward Berlin's outer defenses. But Zhukov wasn't simply pushing German forces back, he was trying to destroy them before they could reach the city. Soviet tank columns raced westward, trying to outrun retreating German infantry and cut off their escape routes. This was mobile warfare at its finest. The Red Army's tanks covering 40 kilometers in a single day across terrain that should have slowed them. German commanders recognized the danger. If Soviet forces got behind them, entire divisions would be encircled and destroyed in open country. So, the retreat became a race. German soldiers abandoned equipment, ignored orders to make stands at intermediate positions, and simply ran for Berlin's outer suburbs. Some units maintained cohesion, retreating in organized columns with covering forces protecting their flanks. Others disintegrated into armed mobs, individuals and small groups making their own way westward. Soviet aircraft strafed the retreating columns mercilessly. Soviet tanks, encountering German infantry on the roads, didn't even slow down. They simply crushed through the formations, leaving German soldiers to either scatter or die. The encirclement wasn't just a military operation, it was a race between competing Soviet commanders. Zhukov, attacking directly toward Berlin, had the shortest route but also the stiffest resistance. Konev, approaching from the south, faced lighter opposition but had farther to travel. Stalin's ambiguous boundary between their sectors meant both marshals believed they could legitimately claim Berlin as their objective. This turned the encirclement into a competition, with units sometimes taking unnecessary risks to outpace their supposed allies. On April 21st, Konev's lead tanks reached the Teltow Canal on Berlin's southern edge, a major symbolic achievement. Konev immediately telephoned Stalin to report the success, emphasizing that his forces had reached Berlin before Zhukov's. Stalin, enjoying the rivalry, congratulated Konev, while subtly reminding him that reaching Berlin's suburbs wasn't the same as capturing the city center. Zhukov, hearing of Konev's achievement, ordered his forces to accelerate regardless of casualties. What should have been coordinated military operations became a race where Soviet soldiers died because their commanders wanted bragging rights. The German forces outside Berlin faced an impossible dilemma. Hitler ordered them to hold their positions and prevent Soviet encirclement. But holding positions meant being surrounded and destroyed. Retreating meant abandoning positions and facing possible execution for disobeying orders. Most commanders chose retreat, gambling that by the time they faced courts-martial for disobeying Hitler, the war would be over and such proceedings meaningless. But one concentration of German forces, the Ninth Army, approximately 120,000 men trapped southeast of Berlin, chose a different path. General Theodor Buss, commanding the Ninth Army, received Hitler's order to turn and attack the Soviet forces encircling Berlin from the east. Buss recognized this was suicide. His army had been shattered at Silo Heights, was low on ammunition and fuel, and was being pursued by overwhelming Soviet forces. Attacking would accomplish nothing except getting his soldiers killed. But Buss also understood that retreating meant abandoning Berlin to its fate, so he attempted a compromise. He would retreat westward while maintaining enough cohesion to theoretically attack if ordered. This middle path satisfied no one and ultimately doomed the Ninth Army to destruction. By April 23rd, the encirclement was nearly complete. Soviet forces had closed to within 12 kilometers of Berlin's center from multiple directions. German forces outside the city were either surrounded, retreating in disorder, or had already been destroyed. The Ninth Army, attempting to break through Soviet lines and reach Berlin, was being systematically shredded. Individual German divisions, cut off from higher command, made their own decisions about whether to continue fighting, attempt to surrender, or try to break through to Berlin. Some succeeded in reaching the city, joining the defenders. Others were intercepted and destroyed. Many simply disintegrated, soldiers discarding weapons and walking away from the war. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered Europe just 5 years earlier, was coming apart at every level. Units ignored orders. Officers made independent decisions without consulting superiors. Soldiers deserted in large numbers. The famous German military discipline, forged over centuries and refined by Prussian traditions, collapsed when it became obvious that continued obedience meant certain death. The civilian experience of the encirclement was characterized by confusion and terror. By late April, perhaps 1.5 million civilians had fled Berlin, heading west toward American and British lines. But millions remained, either unable to leave or unwilling to abandon their homes. These people watched Soviet forces approach from every direction and understood what it meant. Berlin would be surrounded. No food could enter. No one could leave. Whatever happened during the battle would be experienced by everyone inside the trap. Some Berliners prepared basement shelters, stockpiling what food and water they could find. Others made plans for suicide if Soviet troops broke through, rumors of Soviet atrocities having convinced them that death was preferable to capture. The city's infrastructure began breaking down. Water pressure dropped as pumping stations lost power. Electricity became sporadic. Telephones stopped working. Public transportation ceased. Berlin was dying before the battle for the city even properly began. And the civilians trapped inside could only wait for the hammer to fall. On April 25th at 1 p.m., a historic meeting occurred at Torgau on the Elbe River, 120 kilometers southwest of Berlin. Soviet and American forces linked up for the first time. Lieutenant Albert Kotzebue of the U.S. 69th Infantry Division shook hands with Lieutenant Alexander Silvashko of the Soviet 58th Guards Rifle Division. Photographs were taken, toasts were drunk, and Germany was cut in half. This meeting, which should have been a moment of pure celebration, actually highlighted the emerging Cold War tensions. American and Soviet troops eyed each other warily, recognizing that while they were current allies, they might be future enemies. The meeting also meant that German forces still fighting had no hope of shifting between fronts or evacuating westward. They were trapped between Soviet forces advancing from the east and American forces holding on the Elbe. For the soldiers defending Berlin, the Torgau meeting confirmed what they already knew. There was no rescue coming, no possibility of breaking through to friendly forces in the west. Berlin would stand alone. The completion of the encirclement occurred on April 25th evening. Soviet forces from different fronts linked up on Berlin's western suburbs. The ring was closed. 464,000 German soldiers were trapped inside, along with approximately 2 million civilians. Outside the ring, an additional 250,000 German troops were cut off in the Halbe pocket southeast of the city. These forces, primarily from the Ninth Army, would spend the next week attempting to break through Soviet lines and escape westward. Most would fail. The Halbe breakout attempts, desperate charges by German forces trying to punch through Soviet encirclements, cost approximately 30,000 German lives and accomplished almost nothing strategically. But the attempts illustrated the Wehrmacht's utter desperation. Soldiers knew the war was lost, knew their capital was doomed, knew survival required escape. So, they charged Soviet positions again and again, dying in windrows, achieving nothing except choosing the manner of their deaths. Inside the Berlin pocket, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The city had stockpiled food for about 40 days at reduced rations, but that calculation assumed normal civilian population. With the encirclement complete and refugees swelling the city's numbers, supplies would last perhaps 3 weeks. Water was already scarce. Soviet artillery had damaged pumping stations and broken water mains throughout the eastern suburbs. Electricity was available only sporadically. Medical supplies were critically low. Hospitals were overwhelmed with military and civilian casualties. And the battle for the city itself, the street by street, building by building, fighting, hadn't even begun. The encirclement meant that every resource consumed was irreplaceable. Every casualty taken was permanent. There would be no reinforcements, no resupply, no relief. Defenders could only use what was already inside the pocket, and when those resources were exhausted, the defense would collapse. This mathematics was obvious to everyone. The question wasn't whether Berlin would fall, but how long its fall would take and how many would die during the interval. The psychological impact of encirclement was profound. German soldiers could look at maps and see that they were surrounded by forces many times their strength. They could hear Soviet artillery from every direction. They knew no help was coming, and yet they kept fighting. Some fought because they believed in the Nazi cause to the end. Others fought because they feared Soviet revenge more than they feared death. Many fought simply because they were soldiers and saw no alternative. Surrendering to the Soviets seemed as dangerous as fighting them. The civilians trapped in the pocket faced different psychological stresses. They were hostages to a battle they couldn't control and couldn't escape. Their city was being destroyed around them. Food grew scarcer daily. Water had to be carried from broken mains or scooped from canals. And the sounds of battle artillery, machine guns, exploding bombs created a constant symphony of terror. Some civilians broke mentally, retreating into catatonic states or experiencing psychotic episodes. Others found reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed, maintaining routines and caring for family members despite the chaos. Berlin's encirclement created a trapped population that would endure 2 weeks of urban warfare with no possibility of escape. What that experience did to the human psyche would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. By April 26th, Soviet forces held a ring around Berlin, approximately 15 kilometers in diameter at its widest point. Inside that ring, the real battle would unfold. The encirclement had been achieved with remarkable speed, 10 days from the Silo Heights breakthrough to complete encirclement. Soviet casualties during this phase approached 50,000. German casualties were harder to calculate, but certainly exceeded 100,000 when killed, wounded, and captured were counted together. The armies were now positioned for the final act. Soviet forces would compress the pocket, driving toward the city center and the Reich Chancellery. German forces would fight a desperate delaying action, trying to hold out until what? No one could articulate what they were holding out for. The Ninth Army was destroyed. No relief force existed. The Allies would not negotiate a separate peace. Hitler would not evacuate. There was no victory condition, no achievable objective beyond postponing inevitable defeat. And yet the battle would continue for another 2 weeks. Thousands more would die. The city would be reduced to rubble. And in the end, Berlin would fall anyway. The encirclement wasn't just a military operation, it was the creation of a trap from which there was no escape. The trap had been sprung. Now it would slowly tighten until everything inside was crushed. April 21st, 1945, Köpenick District, southeastern Berlin. A Soviet rifle company advances down Lindenstrasse, a tree-lined residential street that looks remarkably normal for a war zone. The houses are intact. Gardens show signs of spring growth. A bicycle leans against a fence. The scene is so ordinary that Soviet soldiers relax fractionally. Perhaps this district won't be defended. Perhaps they'll walk to the city center without firing a shot. Then the world explodes. Machine gun fire erupts from a basement window. A Panzerfaust rocket shoots from a second-floor window, destroying the company's supporting tank. Grenades cascade from rooftops. The entire street becomes a killing zone in seconds. Soviet soldiers dive for cover, return fire, call for artillery support. But where do you aim artillery when the enemy is in every building, when civilians might be sheltering in basements, when destroying the structure might kill your own troops taking cover beside it? The company commander realizes with sickening certainty that everything he learned about warfare on the Eastern Front is inadequate for this environment. Open country tactics don't work when there is no open country. The rules have changed, and Soviet forces will pay a terrible price learning the new rules. Urban warfare is fundamentally different from combat in open terrain. In fields and forests, you can see enemies at distance, call in artillery or airstrikes, maneuver to flank positions. In cities, visibility is measured in meters. Artillery becomes dangerous to both sides. Shells ricochet off buildings, create shrapnel that endangers everyone, collapse structures onto attacker and defender alike. Flanking maneuvers are impossible when every side street might contain an ambush. Movement is channeled through streets and intersections that defenders can cover with interlocking fire. Every building is a potential fortress. Every basement is a bunker. Every window is a firing position. The Red Army had experienced urban warfare before Stalingrad was the most famous example. But Stalingrad was 3 years earlier, and many veterans of that battle were dead. The soldiers attacking Berlin suburbs in April 1945 included many who had only fought mobile warfare, advancing across open country, overwhelming German positions through superior numbers and firepower. Now, they were learning that numerical superiority means little when you're advancing down a street where a single machine gunner can pin down a company. The German defenders of Berlin's suburbs were a mixed force that paradoxically made them more effective. Wehrmacht regulars brought tactical expertise. Waffen-SS brought fanatic determination. Volkssturm brought local knowledge. These men knew every street, every building, every shortcut and hiding place. Hitler Youth brought reckless courage, born of indoctrination and adolescent certainty. This combination created a defense in depth that had no front line, no organized structure, but was maddeningly difficult to eliminate. Soviet forces would clear a building, post guards, and move on only to receive fire from that same building hours later, because defenders had infiltrated back through basement connections or sewer tunnels. A block would be captured in the morning and contested again by afternoon. Progress became nearly impossible to measure. Soviet commanders, trained to think in terms of kilometers advanced per day, found themselves struggling to capture individual intersections. The frustration was immense. You could see Berlin's radio tower, the Funkturm, on the western horizon, perhaps 10 kilometers away, but those 10 kilometers might take a week to cover at this pace. The tactical evolution happened rapidly out of necessity. Soviet forces began forming storm groups, mixed units of 50 to 100 men, combining infantry, engineers, tank support, and specialized weapons like flamethrowers. These groups developed new tactics through brutal trial and error. Rather than advancing down streets, they learned to move through buildings. Engineers would blow holes in walls, mouse holes, allowing soldiers to move from building to building without exposing themselves in the street. Flamethrower teams would clear rooms by pumping burning fuel through windows or doors, incinerating anyone inside. Tanks, which were vulnerable on streets, would position themselves at intersections and provide direct fire support, blasting buildings where defenders were identified. Snipers would set up in upper floors of captured buildings, engaging German defenders trying to reposition. The process was systematic but slow. A single city block might require an entire day to clear, and there were hundreds of blocks between the suburbs and the city center. The weapons used in urban combat were different from those preferred in open terrain. Rifles and machine guns remained essential, but their long range was rarely useful when engagements occurred at 10 or 20 meters. Submachine guns, PPS-41s for Soviets, MP-40s for Germans, became the preferred infantry weapons because they provided high volume of fire at close range. Grenades were used constantly, thrown through windows, into basements, around corners. The RG-42 Soviet grenades, which could be thrown farther than German stick grenades, gave Soviet infantry an advantage in grenade duels. Anti-tank weapons became building destroyers. Panzerfausts and Soviet PTRS anti-tank rifles could blow holes in walls or destroy machine gun nests. Artillery shifted from long-range bombardment to direct fire. Soviet commanders would roll heavy guns, 122mm howitzers, right up to buildings and fire point-blank through walls. The effect was devastating but terribly expensive in shells. A single fortified building might consume hundreds of artillery shells before being neutralized. The casualty rates in suburban combat shocked both sides. Soviet rifle companies expected to lose 20 to 30% casualties in a successful assault on an open field position. In Berlin's suburbs, companies regularly suffered 50 to 70% casualties, clearing a single block. The causes were multiple. Defenders had excellent covered positions. Attackers had to expose themselves while advancing. Buildings that seemed cleared often contained hidden defenders. Booby traps, grenades rigged to explode when doors opened. Mines buried in rubble killed soldiers constantly. And the close quarters nature of combat meant that when firefights erupted, they were instantly lethal. At 5 meters, small arms fire is almost impossible to survive unless you're behind solid cover. Soviet medical services, efficient in open warfare, struggled to evacuate wounded from urban combat. Carrying wounded through contested streets under fire was extremely dangerous. Many wounded soldiers died not from their initial injuries, but from bleeding out before they could be evacuated. German casualties were also severe, but harder to calculate. Wehrmacht units kept decent casualty records early on, but by late April those systems had collapsed. Wounded defenders were treated in basement aid stations without proper medical supplies. Many died of infections from wounds that would have been survivable with antibiotics and proper care. The civilian experience of the suburban fighting was nightmarish. German propaganda had told Berliners to stay in their homes, that the Wehrmacht and Volkssturm would protect them. Instead, homes became battlefields. A family sheltering in their basement might suddenly find Wehrmacht soldiers taking up positions in rooms above them. Then, Soviet troops would assault the building. Artillery would hit, the structure would catch fire or collapse, and the family, trapped in the basement, would have to choose between staying and being buried alive or fleeing and getting shot in the crossfire. Thousands of civilians died this way, not deliberately targeted but caught in combat between forces that had no way to distinguish combatants from non-combatants in the chaos. Other civilians were killed by the defenders themselves. SS blocking troops shot German civilians who tried to flee toward Soviet lines. Hitler Youth members, convinced that anyone not fighting was a traitor, threatened residents who displayed white flags. The city was consuming its own population. By April 24th, Soviet forces had penetrated about 5 kilometers into Berlin's suburbs and eastern districts. In open country, 5 kilometers per day was slow. In urban warfare, it represented remarkable progress. But the cost was staggering. Zhukov's First Belarusian Front reported approximately 12,000 casualties just in the suburban fighting. Tank losses were disproportionately high, nearly 200 tanks destroyed in 3 days, most to Panzerfaust ambushes in close-quarters combat. The advance was working, but at a rate and cost that made Stalin's May 1st deadline look increasingly unrealistic. Konev's forces, attacking from the south, were making similar progress at similar cost. And every day, the fighting moved closer to Berlin's dense inner districts, where conditions would be even worse. The suburbs had proven to be costly. The city center would be catastrophic. But Soviet commanders had no option to pause or reconsider. The offensive had its own momentum. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were committed. The world was watching. And Stalin demanded victory by May 1st. So the storm groups continued their brutal work, clearing one building at a time, accepting losses that should have been unacceptable, grinding toward the city center through streets that ran with blood. The transformation of warfare from mobile operations to urban combat marked a psychological shift for both sides. Soviet soldiers had grown accustomed to advancing, seeing enemies flee, experiencing the exhilaration of pursuit and victory. Now they were advancing into death traps, where every window might contain a sniper, every doorway might hide a machine gun. The war, which had seemed nearly won after Silo, suddenly felt endless again. How many more blocks? How many more buildings? How many more comrades would die before this finally ended? German defenders, meanwhile, discovered that urban terrain partially negated Soviet advantages. A Volkssturm member with a Panzerfaust, firing from a basement window at close range, was as deadly as a trained tank destroyer crew. A 15-year-old Hitler Youth with a submachine gun in a ruined building was as dangerous as a Wehrmacht veteran. The suburbs gave defenders hope, not hope for victory, but hope that they could make the Soviets pay so dearly that some negotiated settlement might emerge. It was a false hope, but it kept them fighting. And every day they kept fighting, added hundreds to the casualty lists on both sides. The suburbs were a preview of what the city center would be like. Soviet commanders studied the casualty reports and understood that the worst was yet to come. But understanding doesn't mean you can stop. The machine of war, once set in motion, cannot easily be turned off. It must grind through to conclusion, consuming whoever and whatever stands in its path. Berlin's suburbs were just the beginning. April 22, 1945. Stalin sits in his Kremlin office, smoking his pipe, studying reports from both Zhukov and Konev. Both marshals are reporting progress. Both are requesting permission to advance directly on Berlin's center. Both are essentially asking Stalin to choose between them whose front will have the honor of capturing the Reich Chancellery and Reichstag, the symbolic heart of Nazi power. Stalin smiles. This is exactly the situation he engineered. Two ambitious commanders competing for glory, driving their men harder than any single commander could, sacrificing coordination for speed. The military professionals on Stalin's staff are horrified by the inefficiency units duplicating efforts, creating gaps in coverage, taking unnecessary risks. But Stalin isn't a military professional. He's a political animal who understands that competition produces results even when it produces casualties. He picks up the phone and calls Konev first. The boundary between your front and Zhukov's, Stalin says slowly, ends at Lubin. After that, whoever reaches Berlin first can take it. The implication is clear, but deliberately ambiguous. Konev can legitimately claim the right to enter Berlin from the south. Zhukov, with direct responsibility for the Berlin axis, can claim precedence. Both will race to be first, and Stalin will get his victory by May 1st. The military geography of Berlin strongly favored Zhukov's approach. His first Belarusian front was attacking from the east, directly toward the city center. The shortest route to the Reichstag ran through his sector. He had numerical superiority in troops and equipment, and he carried the title Marshal of Victory, the celebrated commander who had saved Moscow and broken the Wehrmacht's back. By any logical measure, Zhukov should capture Berlin's center. But Konev was a master tactician who had studied the terrain carefully. He noticed that Zhukov's route required crossing the Spree River directly under fire, then advancing through the dense urban terrain of eastern Berlin, where defenders were most concentrated. Konev's first Ukrainian front, attacking from the south, faced less immediate resistance. If he could break through quickly, cross the Teltow Canal, and wheel north toward the city center, he might beat Zhukov despite the longer distance. It was risky. Turning an entire army group 90 degrees while under combat is immensely complicated. But the potential reward was enormous. Konev could claim credit for capturing Berlin, eclipsing his rival's reputation. The competition between the two marshals created absurd and dangerous situations on the ground. On April 24th, Konev's lead tank units crossed the Teltow Canal and began pushing north into Berlin's southern districts. These units were approaching Tempelhof Airport, a major landmark in southern Berlin. Meanwhile, Zhukov's forces were fighting through eastern Berlin toward the same area from a different direction. The boundary between the two fronts was supposed to run through Tempelhof, but the actual line on the ground was unclear. Combat is chaotic, units get disorganized, maps become outdated quickly. Soviet units from both fronts approached Tempelhof simultaneously, neither aware the other was nearby. Shots were exchanged before officers realized they were firing on friendly forces. The incident was hushed up. Soviet authorities couldn't admit that their forces had nearly killed each other in a competition for glory. But similar near catastrophes occurred repeatedly as the two fronts converged on Berlin's center. Staff officers spent more time ensuring their units didn't clash with supposedly friendly forces than coordinating actual combat operations. The rivalry also manifested in how each marshal allocated resources. Zhukov, with direct orders to capture Berlin, committed his best units to assaults on the city center. But he also held back significant forces as reserves, wanting to ensure he had fresh troops available for the final push to the Reichstag. Konev, with no explicit orders regarding Berlin but Stalin's ambiguous permission to enter the city, committed everything available to his northern thrust. He reasoned that if he could get into position first, Stalin would retroactively justify the decision. This meant Konev's leading units advanced with minimal support, taking unnecessary casualties but moving fast. Zhukov's forces advanced more methodically, suffering fewer casualties but moving slower. The mathematical question was whether Konev could reach the center before his forces exhausted themselves, or whether Zhukov's more sustainable approach would win through persistence. Every day, both marshals called Stalin to report progress and subtly denigrate the other's achievements. Stalin encouraged this, praising both while committing to neither. On April 25th, Stalin made a decision that supposedly clarified the situation. He redrew the boundary between the fronts, establishing a clear line that ended approximately 150 meters east of the Reichstag. This meant Konev's forces could not enter the government district or assault the Reichstag itself. Those objectives belonged exclusively to Zhukov. Konev was furious, but couldn't protest without appearing insubordinate. He had gotten his troops into southern Berlin at terrible cost, hoping to capture the most prestigious objectives. Now, Stalin was telling him to stop short and let Zhukov claim the glory. The decision was presented as military necessity. Having two fronts attack the Reichstag from different directions would be impossibly confusing. But everyone understood the real reason. Stalin was rewarding Zhukov for his overall command by giving him Berlin's most symbolic target. Konev would have to settle for helping encircle the city and cutting off escape routes. It was significant work, but not headline-making. The cost of the competition can be calculated in wasted effort and unnecessary casualties. Soviet forces from both fronts assaulted areas that could have been bypassed or isolated with fewer losses if coordination had been prioritized over speed. Units advanced into dangerous positions without adequate flank protection, because protecting flanks meant slowing down. Artillery support was sometimes unavailable because guns were being rushed forward to support the next assault, rather than properly supporting current operations. Medical services struggled because ambulances were commandeered to move ammunition forward. Keeping the advance moving took precedence over evacuating wounded. Estimates suggest that the competition between Zhukov and Konev added approximately 5,000 unnecessary Soviet casualties, soldiers who died not because their deaths achieved military objectives, but because their commanders wanted to beat rival units to symbolic locations. 5,000 soldiers, each with families, with futures, with possibilities sacrificed to Stalin's game of divide and compete. The soldiers on the ground weren't stupid. They understood what was happening. Letters home and later memoirs reveal that Soviet infantry knew they were part of a race between marshals. Some found it motivating Soviet culture, encouraged competition, and celebrated ambitious individuals pushing toward goals. Others found it demoralizing. Why risk your life capturing a building today when you could approach more carefully tomorrow? But motivation or demoralization hardly mattered. Orders were orders. If your commander says assault this position now because Konev's units are approaching from the other direction, you assault. To refuse is cowardice, punishable by summary execution. Soviet military doctrine had no room for soldiers questioning strategic decisions. You followed orders, killed enemies, and hoped you survived long enough to see victory. The marshals' rivalry was just another aspect of the war's fundamental absurdity. Powerful men making decisions that got ordinary men killed for reasons that often had little to do with military necessity. By April 27th, the race's outcome was clear, even if not yet official. Zhukov's forces were within 2 kilometers of the Reichstag, fighting through the dense government district. Konev's forces were still in southern Berlin, too far south to realistically reach the city center first. Konev had lost his race, though he would continue fighting for several more days, clearing Berlin's southern and southwestern districts. The work was important. His forces prevented German forces from escaping southward and linked up with American troops on the Elbe. But it wasn't the glory he had sought. Zhukov had won Stalin's manufactured competition. The honor of storming the Reichstag, of planting the Soviet flag on German fascism's symbolic heart, would belong to units under Zhukov's command. The victory would be shared. Of course, the Red Army conquered Berlin, not any individual commander, but the history books would remember that Zhukov's forces took the Reichstag. And, in Soviet culture, where personal glory and historical recognition mattered enormously, that distinction was worth the thousands of lives spent achieving it. The relationship between Zhukov and Konev never recovered from Berlin. In the immediate post-war period, both were celebrated as heroes of the Soviet Union. But privately, the rivalry festered. Konev believed he had been cheated, that Stalin's ambiguous orders set up a competition and then changed the rules when Konev was winning. Zhukov believed his rival had needlessly complicated the Berlin operation through aggressive risk-taking. Both men were probably right. In later years, when Konev wrote his memoirs, he devoted considerable space to justifying his Berlin decisions and subtly criticizing Zhukov's more cautious approach. Zhukov's memoirs acknowledged Konev's contributions, but emphasized the First Belarusian Front's central role. Neither marshal could admit the truth, that both had been manipulated by Stalin, that their competition served political rather than military purposes, and that soldiers died because their commanders cared more about prestige than about minimizing casualties. Such admissions would be politically impossible in the Soviet Union and psychologically devastating for men who had built their identities around being brilliant military commanders. The race for the Reichstag illustrated a fundamental truth about war. Military operations are never purely military. They're always embedded in political contexts, personal ambitions, institutional rivalries, and cultural values. The Battle of Berlin could have been conducted with better coordination between fronts, resulting in fewer casualties and possibly faster victory. But that approach wouldn't have satisfied Stalin's political needs or the Marshal's personal ambitions, so soldiers died in greater numbers than necessary. Buildings were assaulted by multiple units, duplicating effort. Resources were wasted on symbolic objectives that contributed little to military victory. And yet, somehow, the operation succeeded. Berlin fell. Germany surrendered. The war ended. From a purely outcome-based perspective, Stalin's approach worked. The human cost of that approach, the soldiers who died unnecessarily, the families destroyed, the trauma inflicted doesn't appear in official victory calculations. But it was real, permanent, and enormous. The race for the Reichstag had winners and losers, but all of them paid in blood. April 26, 1945. Prenzlauer Berg District, northeastern Berlin. A basement shelter designed for 50 people holds 300. They've been underground for 4 days. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, excrement, fear. Overhead, the building shudders constantly, artillery, bombs, tank shells, the percussion of urban warfare. No one knows what's happening above ground. Soviet forces, German defenders, both. The children stopped crying 2 days ago, too exhausted for tears. The adults sit in darkness, the electricity failed on day 2, listening to the sounds of their city dying. Then the sounds change. Not distant thunder anymore, but close, immediate. Footsteps on the stairs, voices in Russian. Someone screams. The shelter door, reinforced steel, supposed to be secure, shutters under sledgehammer blows. The civilians huddle together, knowing that whatever comes through that door will change everything. This is the fighting for Berlin's inner rings, where the boundaries between military and civilian, between battlefield and home, have completely dissolved. There is no front line anymore. There is only chaos, terror, and death arriving in basement shelters that were supposed to be safe. The inner rings of Berlin's defense were defined as the districts within 6 kilometers of the city center. This included neighborhoods like Wedding, Moabit, Kreuzberg, and Friedrichshain, areas of dense 19th century housing built for the working class. These districts were perfect defensive terrain. Buildings stood 5 or 6 stories tall, their thick brick walls resistant to small arms fire. Courtyards connected multiple buildings, allowing defenders to move between positions without exposing themselves to street fire. Basements, interconnected through shared walls, created underground networks that troops could use for infiltration. The streets were narrow, hemmed in by tall buildings that channeled attackers into killing zones. Every intersection became a fortress. Every block was a battle. Soviet forces attacking these inner rings found themselves in a nightmare of urban combat, where their advantages in artillery and armor meant progressively less. You can't use heavy artillery freely when every building contains civilians. You can't maneuver tanks effectively when streets are blocked by rubble, and every alley might contain a Panzerfaust team. The fighting devolved into small unit actions, squads, and platoons, clearing buildings room by room, floor by floor, suffering casualties that would have been considered catastrophic in open warfare, but became routine in the inner city. The defenders of the inner rings represented the absolute bottom of Germany's military barrel. By late April, organized Wehrmacht units were rare. Most defenders were Volkssturm, old men and teenagers given rifles and told to hold positions they barely understood. Waffen-SS troops provided some military competence, but were spread thin. Often just a handful of SS soldiers stiffening larger groups of Volkssturm. Hitler Youth continued to be alarmingly effective, their indoctrination and lack of fear making them dangerous opponents despite their age. But perhaps the most significant defenders were the buildings themselves. The architecture of Berlin's working-class districts, solid construction, thick walls, interconnected structures, multiplied the effectiveness of even poorly trained defenders. A Volkssturm man who couldn't hit targets at 100 meters in a field could be deadly firing from a second-floor window at Soviet troops in the street below. A Hitler Youth who would be helpless in open combat could destroy a tank with a Panzerfaust fired from a basement window. The urban environment transformed inadequate defenders into formidable obstacles. The tactics of urban warfare evolved daily through brutal trial and error. Soviet storm groups learned to avoid streets whenever possible, moving through buildings via blown holes in walls. Engineers became critical. Every storm group needed soldiers who could blast through walls, disable booby traps, and identify structural weak points in buildings. Flamethrower teams were essential but terrifying to operate. Carrying tanks of pressurized fuel made operators high-value targets. When flamethrowers worked, they cleared rooms in seconds, burning defenders alive or driving them into surrender. When they failed, tanks ruptured by bullets, operators hit by grenades, the results were horrific. Snipers on both sides turned the upper stories of buildings into hunting grounds. Soviet snipers would occupy rooms in captured buildings, engaging German defenders trying to reposition. German snipers targeted Soviet officers and NCOs, recognizing that killing leaders disrupted unit cohesion. The sniper duels could last days, each side trying to identify the other's position and get one clear shot. Often, both snipers died, killed by artillery or assault teams that finally cleared their positions. The artillery problem became acute in the inner rings. Heavy bombardment destroyed buildings, yes, but it also created rubble that blocked streets and provided cover for defenders. Soviet commanders faced impossible choices. Artillery made assaults easier by suppressing defenders, but harder by creating physical obstacles. Should you level a building before assaulting it, creating debris that your troops must then clear while under fire from surrounding structures? Or assault the intact building, facing defenders in strong positions but dealing with less physical obstruction? There was no good answer. Different commanders made different choices with equally bloody results. Some Soviet artillery officers began using direct-fire rolling guns right up to buildings and shooting through walls at point-blank range. This was effective, but dangerous. German defenders would target the gun crews with everything available. Losing a gun to enemy action was acceptable in Soviet doctrine. Losing a gun and its crew because you positioned them too close to the enemy was negligence. But desperate situations demanded desperate measures. By late April, Soviet gunners were positioning field pieces in Berlin's streets like medieval siege engines, accepting casualties to provide the direct fire support that storm groups needed. The civilian casualties during the inner ring fighting exceeded anything previously experienced in Berlin. The city had endured years of Allied bombing raids, but those raids had warning systems and shelters. Civilians could seek cover, know when attacks were coming, prepare. The street fighting provided no such mercies. Combat erupted suddenly, unpredictably. In residential areas, a basement shelter would be safe one moment and a battlefield the next. Families caught in buildings during firefights faced impossible choices. Stay in the basement and risk the building collapsing on you or defenders flooding your shelter position. Try to flee and get shot in the crossfire. Display white flags and hope both sides recognize your non-combatant status, though white flags often provoked execution from SS troops who considered surrender treasonous. Thousands of civilians died in these situations, not deliberately targeted by either side, but caught in combat, too chaotic for anyone to distinguish friend from foe, combatant from civilian. The official death toll for Berlin's battle lists, approximately 125,000 civilian deaths. Most died in the inner ring, fighting during late April. The Alexanderplatz battle exemplified the inner ring's horror. Alexanderplatz was a major intersection in central Berlin, surrounded by department stores, government offices, and apartment buildings. In peacetime, it had been a bustling commercial district. By April 27th, it was a fortress. German defenders had converted the Kaufhaus department store into a strongpoint, positioning troops on every floor with clear fields of fire covering the square. Soviet forces needed Alexanderplatz to continue their advance toward the government district. They began assaulting the position on April 27th morning. The battle would last 36 hours. Soviet flame tanks KV-8s, equipped with flamethrowers, attempted to burn defenders out. The tanks approached the store, pumped burning fuel through windows, and set the building ablaze. German defenders retreated to lower floors and kept fighting. Soviet infantry stormed the burning structure, engaging defenders in hand-to-hand combat through smoke-filled hallways. Both sides threw grenades, Both sides used flamethrowers and demolition charges. The Kaufhaus became an inferno, with fighting occurring on multiple levels simultaneously. When Soviet forces finally secured the ruins on April 28th evening, they found approximately 200 German bodies. Wehrmacht, Volkssturm, SS, and Hitler Youth mixed together. They also found 40 civilian bodies in the basement. These were employees and shoppers who had sheltered in the store when fighting began and died when Soviet forces set the building ablaze. Nobody was charged with their deaths. In total war, such casualties are simply recorded and forgotten. The Berlin Zoo battle occurred simultaneously with Alexanderplatz and was, if anything, more surreal. The zoo, located in the Tiergarten district near the city center, had been bombed repeatedly during Allied air raids. Many animals had been killed or evacuated earlier, but some remained, including elephants, big cats, and various exotic species. German defenders used the zoo's ruins as defensive positions, the heavy concrete animal enclosures providing excellent cover. Soviet forces assaulting through the zoo encountered defensive fire from behind hippopotamus pools and lion cages. One Soviet memoir describes seeing a dead giraffe lying across a pathway, killed by artillery. Another describes hearing elephants trumpeting in panic as shells exploded around their enclosure. The surreal horror of fighting through a zoo while exotic animals fled or died around them traumatized soldiers on both sides. The zoo battle lasted 3 days and achieved little. The position was militarily insignificant, just another defended location that had to be cleared. By the time Soviet forces secured the area on April 29th, the zoo was completely destroyed. The few surviving animals either escaped into the burning city. There are reports of zoo animals roaming Berlin's streets during the final days, or were shot by soldiers who saw them as dangerous or simply wanted to prevent their suffering. The Berlin Zoo had been one of Europe's finest. The battle reduced it to a graveyard. By April 28th, the first suicides began occurring in significant numbers. German civilians, particularly women, faced terrifying prospects if captured by Soviet forces. Years of propaganda had emphasized Soviet brutality. Refugees from the East had brought stories of rape and murder. As Soviet troops pushed deeper into Berlin, civilians calculated their odds, and some chose death over capture. Families took poison together. Mothers killed their children and then themselves. Elderly couples hanged themselves in their apartments. The methods were often desperate and brutal, wrist-cutting, drowning in bathtubs, jumping from buildings. German authorities, what remained of them, tried to suppress news of the suicides, fearing they would create panic. But in a city being torn apart by combat, preventing information spread was impossible. The suicide epidemic peaked in early May after the battle ended, but it began during the inner ring fighting when civilians first truly understood what was coming. The psychological trauma of being trapped in a city-sized combat zone, with no escape and no hope, broke thousands of minds. Some became catatonic, withdrawing into unresponsive states. Others became hysterical, crying or screaming uncontrollably. And some made the cold calculation that death now, self-inflicted, was preferable to whatever awaited them if they survived. The Red Army's behavior during the inner ring fighting was characterized by increasing brutality. Soviet soldiers had fought their way across Eastern Europe, seeing the destruction Germany had inflicted on the Soviet Union. They had liberated concentration camps and seen evidence of atrocities. Many had lost family members to German occupation. Now, fighting in the German capital, surrounded by buildings that symbolized the regime that had invaded their homeland, some Soviet troops exacted revenge. Red Army War Trophy units, officially charged with seizing valuable equipment and art, also engaged in systematic looting. Individual soldiers took whatever valuables they could carry: watches, jewelry, cameras, anything portable and valuable. Soviet officers often participated or looked away. More seriously, sexual violence became widespread. Soviet troops in Berlin sexually assaulted German women systematically. Estimates suggest 95,000 to 130,000 rapes in Berlin alone during the battle and its immediate aftermath. The violence was sometimes opportunistic individual soldiers assaulting civilians they encountered. Sometimes it was organized groups of soldiers systematically searching buildings for women. Soviet authorities did little to stop it. Some commanders enforced discipline, punishing rapists with immediate execution. Others treated sexual violence as acceptable reward for victory. The inconsistency meant that a woman's fate often depended on which Soviet unit controlled her district. Some units maintained discipline, others were barbaric. The sexual violence of Berlin's battle remains one of history's most suppressed atrocities. Denied by Soviet authorities for decades and only extensively documented after the Soviet Union's collapse. The fighting for Berlin's inner rings was the war reduced to its most primal form. Strategic considerations disappeared. Political objectives became meaningless. It was just humans killing humans, building by building, room by room, in conditions of unimaginable brutality. The civilized veneer of warfare, rules of engagement, treatment of prisoners, protection of civilians shattered completely. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides suffered terribly. And for what? Germany had already lost. Berlin's fall was inevitable. The inner ring fighting achieved nothing strategically that couldn't have been achieved through negotiated surrender. But negotiation requires trust and communication between parties who recognize mutual interest in limiting violence. In April 1945 Berlin, no such conditions existed. Hitler would not surrender. Stalin would not negotiate. So the killing continued. Buildings that had stood for centuries were destroyed in hours. Neighborhoods that had housed families for generations became battlefields where those families died. The inner rings of Berlin weren't just a battle, they were a descent into madness where war's logic consumed everything human. Soldiers became killing machines, civilians became collateral damage. And the city itself became a monument to war's ultimate cruelty, that it doesn't end until one side can no longer continue. Regardless of how many must die in the interval between defeat's certainty and its formal acknowledgement. The inner rings were hell, and hell, it turned out, was a 6-kilometer radius around the Reich Chancellery, where everyone, soldier and civilian, German and Soviet, guilty and innocent, suffered equally. April 27th, 1945. Schöneberg District, Southern Berlin. A Waffen-SS blocking detachment, 30 men in field gray uniforms with distinctive collar insignia, has set up a checkpoint on a street corner. Their job is not to fight the Soviets. Their job is to kill Germans. Specifically, to kill German soldiers attempting to retreat without orders, German civilians trying to flee toward Soviet lines, anyone displaying white flags or advocating surrender. As Soviet artillery pounds positions 2 blocks away, the SS men stop a Wehrmacht lieutenant and 3 soldiers heading west. The lieutenant explains that his unit is destroyed, that he's leading survivors to regroup at a fallback position. The SS Hauptsturmführer commanding the checkpoint demands written orders. The lieutenant has none. His company commander is dead. Radio communications are gone. He's operating on tactical judgment. The SS officer nods slowly, then shoots the lieutenant in the head at point-blank range. He orders his men to execute the 3 soldiers as deserters. The bodies are left hanging from a streetlight as a warning. This is what the Battle of Berlin became in its final week, a war on 2 fronts, fighting the Soviets and fighting Germans who wanted the war to end. The fanatics would accept no surrender, no retreat, no acknowledgement of defeat. They would fight until killed or captured, and they would kill anyone who suggested any alternative. The Waffen-SS presence in Berlin was significant but not overwhelming. Estimates suggest approximately 10,000 SS troops defended the city, including units from various divisions redeployed from other fronts. These weren't all German. The SS had recruited throughout occupied Europe, creating units of Dutch, French, Scandinavian, and Baltic volunteers united by anti-communism and, often, ideology compatible with Nazism. Many of these foreign SS volunteers were in Berlin during the final battle, having nowhere else to retreat to. The Soviet Union certainly wouldn't show mercy to foreign volunteers who'd fought for Germany. Western allies would likely prosecute them as collaborators. So they fought in Berlin, not because they believed Germany could win, but because they had no alternatives. The German SS troops were more ideologically committed. Many had joined the SS specifically because of Nazi beliefs. Others had been shaped by years of indoctrination and combat on the Eastern Front, where the war had been conducted with genocidal intensity. These men had committed atrocities, participated in massacres, guarded concentration camps, executed prisoners. They knew what awaited if captured, so they fought with desperate fanaticism, understanding that surrender meant execution after trial. Better to die fighting than hang after defeat. The SS tactics in Berlin focused less on defending positions than on preventing surrender. They established roving patrols with authority to execute anyone showing defeatist attitudes. They hung deserters, often just exhausted soldiers looking for food, or trying to reach their families from lampposts and trees throughout the city as warnings. Signs around the hanged bodies read, "I was too cowardly to fight," or "I am a traitor to the fatherland." The psychological effect was significant. Wehrmacht soldiers and Volkssturm members who might otherwise have surrendered kept fighting, afraid that SS blocking troops would kill them before Soviet troops could accept their surrender. Civilians who might have displayed white flags kept them hidden, fearing SS reprisal. The SS created a terror regime within Berlin that coexisted with the external terror of Soviet assault. You could die from Soviet artillery, or Soviet infantry assault, or SS execution for insufficient fanaticism. The multiple threats created a surreal environment where German civilians and soldiers feared their supposed protectors as much as the invading enemy. The Hitler Youth presence in Berlin's final battle was the war's ultimate tragedy. These were children most between 12 and 17 years old who had been indoctrinated from early childhood in Nazi ideology. They had attended schools where textbooks taught that dying for Hitler was the highest possible honor. They had participated in youth organizations where military drill and weapons training replaced sports and hobbies. They had consumed propaganda telling them that Germany's defeat would mean national extinction. Now, as the final battle raged, they volunteered to fight in numbers that horrified even some Wehrmacht officers. Colonel Hans von Luck later wrote, "Seeing boys 12 years old in uniform, carrying Panzerfausts, preparing to attack Soviet tanks, was the moment I finally understood we had lost not just militarily, but morally. What kind of nation sends children to die in a war already lost?" But Hitler Youth leadership didn't share such qualms. They distributed weapons to boys barely strong enough to carry them and praised their fighting spirit as an example to adults who showed less enthusiasm. The effectiveness of Hitler Youth units in combat was tragically real. Their indoctrination made them fearless, not brave, but literally unable to properly assess danger. A 15-year-old, convinced that dying for the Führer guaranteed eternal glory, would take risks that experienced soldiers knew were suicidal. This made them effective in limited tactical situations. A Hitler Youth with a Panzerfaust hiding in rubble could destroy a Soviet tank because he wouldn't flee when the tank's machine guns engaged his position. He would fire his rocket and accept death. Soviet veterans later recounted being disturbed by combat with child soldiers. Killing armed combatants is one thing. Killing children, even when those children are trying to kill you, creates a different moral burden. Some Soviet soldiers refused to shoot Hitler Youth when they could avoid it, trying to take them prisoner instead. Others became more brutal, reasoning that anyone who would arm children deserved no mercy. The Hitler Youth presence ensured Berlin's final battle would include child casualties, adding another layer of tragedy to an already catastrophic situation. The ideological commitment of SS and Hitler Youth created tactical challenges for Soviet forces. Soldiers who will surrender when faced with overwhelming odds are manageable. You accept their surrender, disarm them, and move on. Soldiers who fight to the death require you to kill them all, a slower and more costly process. Soviet commanders estimated that clearing a building defended by Wehrmacht troops required 4 to 6 hours. The same building defended by SS or Hitler Youth might require 12 hours or more, because defenders wouldn't surrender even when their position became untenable. The only option was to kill them all or drive them out with fire and demolition. This meant more ammunition expended, more Soviet casualties taken, more time wasted. The fanaticism was militarily counterproductive. It didn't change the battle's outcome, but increased casualties on both sides. Yet, from the fanatics' perspective, this was success. If you can't win, the next best thing is making your enemy pay the maximum price for victory. SS and Hitler Youth achieved this through their willingness to die for positions that military logic said should be abandoned. One incident from April 28th illustrates the horror of fighting child soldiers. A Soviet rifle squad encountered a group of Hitler Youth 9 boys, ages 12 to 16, defending a barricade in the Tiergarten district. The boys opened fire with rifles and submachine guns, wounding 2 Soviet soldiers. The squad sergeant, a veteran who had fought since Stalingrad, tried negotiating. Through an interpreter, he told the boys to surrender, that they would be treated well, that the war was over. The boys refused. They shouted Nazi slogans and continued firing. The sergeant, his patience exhausted and mindful of his mission to advance, called in a tank. The tank fired 1 high-explosive shell directly into the barricade. When Soviet troops advanced through the smoke, they found 7 boys dead, torn apart by shrapnel. 2 survivors, both wounded, were captured. 1 died of his wounds within hours. The other, 13 years old, would survive the war and spend years in a Soviet labor camp. In his memoir published decades later, the Soviet sergeant who ordered the tank fire wrote, "I killed many Germans during the war, but those 9 boys in the Tiergarten haunted me forever. Not because I felt guilty they were armed enemy combatants, but because I couldn't reconcile killing children with any concept of victory. We won the war that day, but at what cost to our humanity?" The final Hitler Youth operation was perhaps the saddest episode of Berlin's battle. On April 30th, as Hitler prepared for suicide in the bunker, approximately 200 Hitler Youth members attempted a mass breakout from the Tiergarten area. Their plan was to escape the city, cross Soviet lines at night, and continue fighting as partisans in the countryside. They equipped themselves with bicycles for mobility. The absurd image of children on bicycles carrying Panzerfausts became emblematic of the operation's hopelessness. They launched their breakout at dusk, riding through ruined streets toward Berlin's outskirts. Soviet forces, alerted by the movement, opened fire. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery targeted the column. Most Hitler Youth were killed within the first kilometer. Some ditched their bicycles and tried to flee on foot. A few succeeded in escaping into the surrounding forests, where they either surrendered to Soviet patrols within days or died from wounds and exposure. By morning, Soviet troops counted 187 bodies along the breakout route. Most were children. The bicycles, many still intact, were gathered and photographed. Soviet propaganda used the images to demonstrate Nazi Germany's desperation, sending children to die in futile gestures. But the photos also revealed something darker: the complete moral bankruptcy of a regime willing to sacrifice children rather than acknowledge defeat. The German internal terror, SS executing soldiers, hanging deserters, killing civilians, continued until the final hours of the battle. On May 1st, even as surrender negotiations were beginning, SS units were still executing Germans for defeatism. In one documented incident, SS troops discovered an apartment building displaying white flags from several windows. They entered the building, identified the apartments with flags, and shot every adult male resident, 14 men total. The women and children were left alive as a warning to others. This occurred not in the heat of battle, but during a relative lull in fighting, suggesting the executions were deliberate policy rather than combat stress. The Soviet troops who later occupied that building found the bodies and documented the atrocity. It became evidence in later war crimes trials. But for the families of the 14 men killed, no trial could restore fathers, brothers, and sons murdered by their own side for the crime of wanting the slaughter to end. The legacy of SS and Hitler Youth fanaticism in Berlin is complex and disturbing. On one level, their presence ensured the battle was more costly and prolonged than militarily necessary. If Berlin had been defended only by Wehrmacht troops willing to surrender when resistance became pointless, the city might have fallen days earlier with fewer casualties. The fanatics' refusal to acknowledge reality added perhaps 3 to 5 days to the battle and thousands of casualties to both sides' totals. But on another level, their fanaticism was the logical endpoint of Nazi ideology. The regime had built itself on promises of racial supremacy, eternal struggle, and the idea that defeat meant extinction. When defeat arrived anyway, true believers couldn't simply abandon those principles and surrender. They had to fight to the end, even knowing the end would come regardless. Their fanaticism wasn't irrational from within their worldview. It was the only response consistent with 12 years of Nazi indoctrination. The tragedy was that their fanaticism killed not just themselves, but everyone around them. Wehrmacht soldiers who wanted to surrender were executed. Civilians who wanted to survive were forced to keep fighting. Children who should have been in school were given weapons and told to die heroically. The fanatics ensured that Berlin's fall would be as destructive as possible, taking as many people German and Soviet with them as they could. In this, they succeeded perfectly, and Berlin burned April 29th, 1945. The Reichstag, building massive, imposing, crowned with a dome, stands in central Berlin like a burned-out monument to a dead empire. The structure hasn't functioned as a parliament since the fire of 1933. It's barely a building anymore, more a concrete shell riddled with bomb and shell damage. Its strategic value is approximately 0. German forces inside number perhaps 300, a mixed group of Wehrmacht, Volkssturm, and SS, who have fortified the ruins because they've been ordered to hold it. But the Reichstag's symbolic value is infinite. This is the building that represented German democracy before Hitler destroyed it. Taking this building means something beyond military victory. It means the complete reversal of Nazism, the Soviets standing triumphant where the Third Reich began. So despite the Reichstag being militarily insignificant, Hitler is in a bunker 400 meters away. Not in this ruined Soviet high command has designated it as the objective. Capturing the Reichstag and raising the Soviet flag on its roof will be the battle's defining image, which means thousands of soldiers will die fighting for a burned-out building that matters only because someone decided it matters. The assault is scheduled for tomorrow morning. The men selected for the honor, and it is considered an honor, check their weapons and write letters they know probably won't be sent. They're attacking a fortress that doesn't need to be attacked. But in war, symbolism kills as surely as bullets. The Reichstag's defenses were formidable, despite the building being semi-ruined. German engineers had been preparing it for weeks. The basement levels were turned into bunkers, with machine gun positions covering every approach. Upper floors, though damaged by bombing, still provided excellent firing positions, overlooking Königsplatz, the open space surrounding the building. The Germans had flooded the basement with water from broken pipes, creating a moat-like obstacle in the lower levels. They had mined the approaches, creating kill zones that Soviet troops would have to cross under fire. Anti-aircraft guns had been repositioned as direct-fire weapons, capable of shredding infantry or light vehicles at close range. The Reichstag's walls, though damaged, were still meter-thick masonry that could stop small arms fire and withstand anything short of heavy artillery. The 300 defenders, while outnumbered, had perhaps the strongest defensive position remaining in Berlin, and they knew the world was watching. Surrender wasn't an option, not because victory was possible, but because being the troops who lost the Reichstag would be historically disgraceful, so they prepared to sell their lives expensively. The Soviet assault began at 6 a.m. on April 30th with an artillery barrage that struck mostly rubble. The Reichstag was already so damaged that additional shelling achieved little. Then Soviet infantry, specifically designated units from the 340th Rifle Division, began advancing across Königsplatz. They immediately took casualties. German machine guns and anti-aircraft weapons swept the open ground methodically. Soviet soldiers ran, crawled, died. The first wave gained perhaps 100 meters before being pinned down by defensive fire. Officers screamed orders. Commissars threatened execution for cowardice. Soldiers advanced anyway because there was nowhere to retreat, to follow orders, or face immediate execution from your own side. By 8 a.m., Soviet forces had reached the Reichstag's outer walls after losing approximately 400 men crossing 200 meters of open ground. The exchange ratio was catastrophic, 400 Soviet casualties to perhaps 12 German defenders killed. But Soviet doctrine didn't emphasize exchange ratios. It emphasized mission accomplishment. The mission was to take the Reichstag, so the assault continued. Breaching the Reichstag's walls required combat engineers with demolition charges. Engineers would dash forward, place explosives against the wall, retreat, and detonate. Then infantry would pour through the breach, or try to. German defenders inside had positioned forces to cover likely breach points. When holes appeared in walls, they would throw grenades through and fire machine guns into the breaches. Soviet infantry pushing through found themselves in deadly close-quarters combat. In darkness, the building's interior had no power, just smoke, shadows, and muzzle flashes. The fighting devolved into room-to-room horror. Bayonets, entrenching tools, knives, even fists were used when ammunition ran out or distances became too close for firearms. By 1 p.m., Soviet forces controlled perhaps 30% of the Reichstag's ground floor, but German defenders still held the upper floors and fired down on Soviet troops inside the building. Progress was measured in rooms cleared per hour. Each room cost lives. The Reichstag was consuming Soviet forces like a furnace consuming fuel. The political pressure to capture the Reichstag by May 1st the next day was enormous. Stalin wanted to announce Berlin's capture on International Workers' Day. His marshals had promised the Reichstag would fall in time. Now, with less than 36 hours remaining, Soviet commanders began accepting risks they would normally reject. Fresh units were committed to the assault with minimal preparation. Artillery fired directly at the building, despite Soviet troops being inside. The risk of friendly fire casualties was accepted as preferable to missing the deadline. Tanks were brought right up to the building and fired point-blank through windows. The tactics worked. German defenses began crumbling under sheer weight of assault, but casualties mounted geometrically. By evening on April 30th, Soviet forces controlled about 60% of the building, but German defenders still held the upper floors, and more critically, they still controlled the roof. The symbolic victory planting the Soviet flag on the Reichstag's dome remained impossible while German troops held elevated positions. At 10:50 p.m. on April 30th, two Soviet soldiers, Sergeant Meliton Kantaria and Junior Sergeant Mikhail Yegorov, fought their way onto the Reichstag's roof and attached a Soviet flag to the damaged dome. This moment would become one of history's most famous images, symbolizing Soviet victory over Nazi Germany. There was just one problem. The battle wasn't over. German defenders still held positions in the Reichstag's lower floors, still fired at Soviet troops, still refused surrender. The flag raising was ceremonial, not tactical, a propaganda moment created while fighting continued below. And it wasn't even the first flag raising. Other Soviet soldiers had planted flags on various parts of the building throughout the day, but Kantaria and Yegorov's flag was the highest, most visible, and most photographable. Soviet photographers and cameramen had accompanied the assault specifically to document this moment. They got their photo, though it would later be revealed as staged, shot after the actual flag raising, with smoke added for dramatic effect, and one soldier's multiple watches photoshopped out to hide evidence of looting. The historic moment was a carefully constructed propaganda image that bore little resemblance to the chaotic, ongoing battle. The final clearing of the Reichstag occurred on May 1st and 2nd, after the symbolic flag raising. German defenders in the basement levels continued fighting for 36 hours after Soviet forces controlled the roof. Why? Some were ideological fanatics who would fight to the end. Others were trapped Soviet troops above, flooding below, no way out except through enemy lines. Some genuinely didn't know the flag had been raised, communication being impossible in the building's chaos. The final German defenders, about 50 men, surrendered on May 2nd morning, hungry, thirsty, wounded, and exhausted. They had held a strategically worthless building for 4 days against overwhelming odds. They had killed perhaps 600 Soviet soldiers and wounded 2,000 more. They had achieved absolutely nothing of military value, but they had made the Soviets pay dearly for their symbolic victory. And in the end, that was all defenders could hope for. When the butcher's bill for the Reichstag was tallied, Soviet casualties approached 2,500 killed and wounded. German casualties were approximately 250 killed and 50 captured. One building. 4 days. Casualties equivalent to multiple divisions in open combat. All for symbolism. The Reichstag assault revealed the tension between political and military objectives that characterized the entire Berlin operation. Militarily, the building could have been bypassed or isolated. Soviet forces could have surrounded it, cut it off from supply and reinforcement, and waited for defenders to surrender when starvation forced the issue. This would have cost perhaps a few dozen casualties and achieved the same result within a week. But politics demanded immediate, dramatic victory. Stalin wanted the flag on the Reichstag by May 1st. His commanders, knowing their careers depended on satisfying Stalin, committed whatever force necessary, regardless of casualties. The result was a bloodbath for symbolic real estate. Soviet soldiers understood what was happening. Letters and memoirs reveal awareness that they were dying for propaganda. But understanding didn't mean they could refuse. Orders were orders. Refusing meant execution. So they assaulted the Reichstag again and again, dying in waves, until sheer attrition broke German resistance. Victory was achieved. The flag flew. The photos were taken, and thousands of families received notifications that their sons, husbands, brothers had died, capturing a burned-out building that meant nothing militarily but everything symbolically. The famous Reichstag photograph, the Soviet flag flying above the ruined dome, smoke and destruction visible below, became an icon of victory. It appeared in newspapers worldwide, was reproduced on posters and stamps, became synonymous with Nazi Germany's defeat. The image communicated triumph, vengeance, the end of fascism. What it didn't communicate was cost. The two soldiers who raised the flag survived the war and lived as Soviet heroes. But the hundreds who died getting them to that rooftop were footnotes, if remembered at all. The photograph was stage shot after the actual event, with poses directed and backgrounds enhanced. One soldier's multiple wristwatches, obvious evidence of looting, were removed through darkroom manipulation. The historic moment was propaganda, carefully constructed to convey a message. The message was true in a larger sense. Soviet forces did conquer Berlin, did defeat Nazi Germany. But the specific image was fabricated, designed to support that truth rather than document it objectively. This was typical of Soviet wartime photography. Images were tools for building narratives, not neutral historical records. And the narratives required implied clean victories, heroic sacrifice, and triumph, without acknowledging the messy realities of war, the looting, the casual brutality, the staggering casualties, the fact that many soldiers died not fighting fascism but racing Konev's troops to symbolic objectives. The Reichstag's fall on May 1st technically gave Stalin his symbolic victory on schedule, but the timing was artificial. Fighting continued throughout Berlin for another full day. The Reichstag was just one building in a city where combat raged across dozens of districts. Claiming victory because one building had been captured while thousands of Germans still fought elsewhere was politics, not military reality. But Stalin didn't care about military reality. He cared about announcing on May 1st that Soviet forces had planted their flag on the Reichstag. He got his announcement. Soviet citizens celebrating International Workers' Day heard about the Reichstag's capture and believed the war was over. It wasn't not yet, but belief mattered more than reality. The Reichstag's symbolic fall marked the psychological end of the war, even as the physical fighting continued. In this sense, Stalin's obsession with May 1st was strategically sound. The photo of the flag on the Reichstag, reproduced globally, announced Nazi Germany's defeat more effectively than any formal surrender document. The building didn't matter. The flag didn't matter. What mattered was the image, the narrative, the story that would be told. And in that story, Soviet heroes triumphantly planted their flag on fascism's symbolic heart. That the cost was 2,500 casualties was simply the price of writing history in your preferred language. The dead couldn't object. The survivors were told they had participated in glory. And the world, looking at that photograph, believed it saw the end of Nazi Germany. Which, in every meaningful sense, it did. The Reichstag battle was militarily unnecessary, but symbolically essential. Understanding this paradox is understanding how modern warfare works, where perception and propaganda matter as much as tactical reality, where symbols cost lives, and where victory is as much about controlling the narrative as controlling territory. April 22, 1945. 8.5 meters below the Reich Chancellery Garden, Adolf Hitler sits in a concrete room that measures approximately 3 meters by 4 meters. This is the Führer bunker, the dictator's final refuge. The walls are thick reinforced concrete, designed to withstand direct hits from heavy bombs. The air is stale, recycled through ventilation systems that hum constantly. There are no windows. The electric lights flicker occasionally when Soviet shells hit nearby, shaking dust from the ceiling. Hitler sits at a table covered with maps, showing German units that no longer exist, defensive lines that have already been overrun, counterattacks that will never occur. His left hand trembles uncontrollably, symptoms of Parkinson's disease that he can no longer hide. At 3 p.m., his daily military conference begins. Generals report that Soviet forces are fighting in Berlin's eastern suburbs, that the Ninth Army cannot break through to relieve the capital, that ammunition and fuel are critically low. Hitler listens to the first few reports, then explodes. "Everyone has betrayed me," he screams. "The army has betrayed me. The SS has betrayed me. Even the German people have betrayed me." He rants for 20 minutes about cowardice, treachery, and lost opportunities. The generals stand silently, faces carefully neutral. They've heard this before. They know the war is lost. No Berlin will fall. No Hitler will not survive. But they also know that contradicting him means immediate execution. So they stand and listen while their Führer screams himself hoarse in an underground bunker as his capital burns above him. This is the collapse of Nazi Germany's command structure leadership, divorced from reality, issuing orders to non-existent armies, maintaining elaborate fictions until the moment Soviet troops break through the bunker door. The Führer bunker complex actually consisted of two connected structures. The older Vorbunker forward bunker was built in 1936 as part of the Reich Chancellery's air raid protection. It was relatively shallow, only 7 meters underground, with thin concrete ceilings vulnerable to heavy bombs. The Führer bunker proper was constructed in 1943 and 44 as the Allied bombing campaign intensified. This new bunker was deeper, better protected, and included living quarters, conference rooms, and facilities for extended occupation. The complex connected to the Reich Chancellery above through concrete stairwells, ventilation shafts, and electrical conduits ran to the surface, providing air and power. In theory, the bunker could support several dozen occupants for weeks. In practice, by late April, it housed approximately 50 people living in cramped, increasingly squalid conditions. The toilets backed up regularly. The ventilation system struggled to clear smoke and dust from above-ground explosions. Water was rationed. Food was adequate but monotonous. The bunker had been designed as temporary refuge during air raids, not as permanent command headquarters during a siege. Now it was both, and the infrastructure wasn't adequate for the purpose. Hitler's daily routine in the bunker followed a bizarre pattern of normalcy amid chaos. He woke late, often not emerging from his rooms until early afternoon. He took lunch with his secretaries and adjutants, discussing movies, music, architecture, anything except the military situation. In the afternoon came the military conference, where generals reported increasingly catastrophic news that Hitler either denied or blamed on subordinates' failures. Evening brought dinner with his inner circle, more small talk carefully avoiding reality. Late at night, Hitler would sometimes emerge from the bunker and walk in the Reich Chancellery garden, surveying bomb damage by moonlight, then back underground to sleep for a few hours before repeating the routine. This bizarre adherence to routine, while Berlin burned above him, illustrated Hitler's complete detachment from reality. He still believed that somehow, impossibly, victory could be achieved. He spoke of relief armies that didn't exist, wonder weapons that would never arrive, political collapse of the Soviet Western alliance that wasn't happening. His subordinates, those trapped in the bunker with him, maintained the fiction because no one wanted to be the person who finally told Hitler the truth. The military conferences became increasingly surreal as the battle progressed. On April 23rd, Hitler ordered General Felix Steiner to attack southward with his corps and relieve Berlin from the north. This order seemed reasonable until you examined details. Steiner's corps existed largely on paper. His units were under strength, undersupplied, and scattered across dozens of kilometers. Most had no tanks, little ammunition, and no capacity to conduct offensive operations. Steiner knew the attack was impossible, but he also knew that reporting its impossibility to Hitler meant being accused of cowardice or treachery. So Steiner attempted to comply, scraped together what forces he could, and launched a half-hearted attack that collapsed within hours. When Hitler learned the attack had failed, or rather, had barely been attempted, he erupted in another rage. "Traitors!" he screamed. "Cowards! All of them!" But what choice did Steiner have? Launch a suicidal attack that would accomplish nothing except getting his soldiers killed? Or disobey Hitler and face immediate execution? Steiner chose a middle path, nominal compliance, that preserved his forces while technically following orders. But to Hitler, This was betrayal. On April 28th, Hitler's isolation was finally penetrated by news from outside that even he couldn't deny. Radio intercepts revealed that Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's loyal SS chief, had attempted to negotiate surrender terms with the Western Allies through Swedish intermediaries. Himmler's betrayal, negotiating behind Hitler's back, destroyed whatever trust remained in the bunker. If Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust and most loyal Nazi, could betray Hitler, then anyone could. Hitler ordered Himmler arrested, though obviously no one in the bunker could actually execute that order. He ranted about betrayal for hours, but beneath the rage was recognition that the end had truly arrived. If Himmler was negotiating surrender, the war was over. Hitler could continue issuing orders to phantom armies, but no one was listening anymore. The Nazi regime had 48 hours to live. Also on April 28, Hitler received news that seemed to crystallize his decision to end his life. Reports arrived probably via radio intercepts that Italian partisans had captured and executed Benito Mussolini, Hitler's fascist ally. Even worse, Mussolini's body had been brought to Milan and hung upside down in a public square, where crowds spat on it and desecrated it. Photographs showed the corpse displayed like a butchered animal. Hitler was terrified that a similar fate awaited him if captured alive. Stalin would probably want him for a show trial, parading him through Moscow before execution. The Western Allies would demand he face trial at Nuremberg. Either way, Hitler would be humiliated, forced to answer for his crimes, denied the martyrdom he believed he deserved. The thought of capture was unbearable. Better to die by his own hand, deny his enemies the satisfaction of putting him on trial. On April 29th, Hitler began preparing for suicide. The wedding of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun occurred just after midnight on April 29th in the bunker's map room. Eva Braun had been Hitler's mistress for years, kept hidden from public view because Hitler believed the German people preferred their Führer to be a bachelor devoted entirely to the nation. Now, with hours to live, Hitler decided to marry her. A municipal official, Walter Wagner, who happened to be in the bunker serving in the Volkssturm, performed a brief civil ceremony. Hitler and Braun signed a marriage certificate. Goebbels and Bormann served as witnesses. The ceremony lasted perhaps 10 minutes. Champagne was poured afterward. Toasts were offered. The scene was grotesquely surreal, a marriage celebration in an underground bunker while Soviet forces fought 300 meters away. But Hitler insisted on this final gesture of normalcy. He wanted Eva Braun to die as Eva Hitler, giving her his name even though she would carry it for less than 48 hours. After the ceremony, Hitler dictated his personal and political testaments, rambling documents that blamed everyone else for Germany's defeat while taking no responsibility himself. He expelled Göring and Himmler from the party for their betrayals. He appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor, and he reaffirmed his belief that the war was lost because Germans had proven themselves unworthy of their Führer. To the end, Hitler blamed everyone but himself. April 30th, 3:30 p.m. Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun retire to Hitler's personal quarters. Hitler has a Walther PPK pistol. Braun has a cyanide capsule. What happens next is known only through testimony of those who heard the gunshot and entered afterward. The most credible accounts suggest Hitler bit a cyanide capsule while simultaneously shooting himself in the head, ensuring death even if one method failed. Eva Braun took cyanide only. Both died within seconds. Their bodies were discovered by aides minutes later. Following Hitler's explicit instructions, the bodies were carried up the stairs into the Reich Chancellery garden. Soviet artillery was hitting the area, but several SS men braved the bombardment to complete Hitler's final order. The bodies were placed in a shallow crater, doused with gasoline from jerry cans, and set alight. The fire burned for hours, while SS men stood at attention, occasionally saluting. It was a pathetic Viking funeral for a dictator who had plunged the world into war. The cremation was incomplete. Soviet troops would later recover partially burned remains, but Hitler's aides had done what they could. The Führer would not be paraded through Moscow in chains. He had escaped through death. The aftermath of Hitler's suicide threw the bunker into chaos. Those who had maintained elaborate fictions of eventual victory could no longer sustain the illusion. If Hitler was dead, what were they fighting for? Goebbels, fanatical to the end, decided to follow his Führer into death. But first, he murdered his 6 children. Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Hulda, Hedda, and Heide Goebbels, ages 4 to 12, were drugged and then poisoned with cyanide capsules. Their mother, Magda Goebbels, participated in the murders, apparently believing it was better for the children to die than to live in a world without National Socialism. The deaths of these children, innocent victims of their parents' ideology, represented the utter moral bankruptcy of Nazism's leadership. After murdering his children, Joseph Goebbels and his wife walked into the garden and committed suicide. Their bodies were also burned, though less thoroughly than Hitler's. With Hitler and Goebbels dead, remaining bunker occupants faced choices. Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary, attempted a breakout through Soviet lines. He likely died during the attempt, though his fate remained uncertain for decades. Some bunker personnel surrendered to Soviet forces when they entered the complex on May 2nd. Others attempted escape through Berlin's subway tunnels with mixed success. The bunker itself, the fortress that was supposed to protect Nazi leadership, became their tomb or prison. Soviet forces occupying the bunker found it a shabby, smoke-stained concrete warren that smelled of death and desperation. The command center of the Third Reich's final days was less impressive than a well-built basement, but it had served its purpose, keeping Hitler and his inner circle physically safe from Soviet assault, even as their regime crumbled. That Hitler chose death over capture meant the bunker ultimately failed its purpose. But the failure was Hitler's choice, not the bunker's inadequacy. The fate of Hitler's remains became one of the war's great mysteries. Soviet troops recovered partially burned bodies from the Reich Chancellery Garden. Forensic examination, including dental records, confirmed the bodies were Hitler and Eva Braun. But Stalin ordered the discovery kept secret. For years, the Soviet government refused to confirm Hitler's death, occasionally suggesting he might have escaped to South America or elsewhere. Why the secrecy? Partly because Stalin wanted the option of discovering Hitler alive, if politically useful. Partly because confirming Hitler's suicide meant admitting that the enemy leader had escaped Soviet justice. The mystery served Soviet purposes. It kept Germans nervous about possible Hitler return, allowed propaganda to occasionally threaten exposure, and generally created uncertainty that Stalin found useful. Not until decades later, after the Soviet Union's collapse, did Russian authorities confirm what forensic evidence had shown in May 1945. Hitler died by suicide in the bunker, and his remains were eventually destroyed by Soviet authorities to prevent his grave from becoming a Nazi shrine. The Führer bunker period, Hitler's final 105 days underground, illustrated the complete failure of Nazi Germany's command structure. A regime that had conquered Europe in 18 months couldn't effectively defend its own capital because leadership was divorced from reality. Hitler issued orders to armies that no longer existed. Generals reported phantom successes to avoid Hitler's rage. No one dared tell the truth because truth-tellers were executed as defeatists. The result was a command structure incapable of adapting to circumstances, incapable of making rational decisions, and ultimately incapable of anything except postponing inevitable defeat while maximizing casualties on both sides. Napoleon, defeated at Waterloo, remained on the battlefield until the outcome was clear, then attempted escape. Hitler, defeated in Berlin, hid underground and committed suicide. The contrast reveals something fundamental about Nazi ideology. It had no mechanism for acknowledging defeat, no process for orderly transition, no acceptance that circumstances might require compromise. Nazism was totalizing total victory or total destruction, with no middle ground. Hitler's bunker period and suicide were the logical endpoint of that ideology. If you can't win, die. Take your wife with you, murder your propagandist minister's children for good measure, and leave the rubble of your capital and the corpses of your soldiers as legacy. The bunker wasn't just Hitler's tomb. It was the tomb of the entire Nazi experiment, a concrete coffin where ideology's collision with reality produced nothing but death. May 1st, 1945, 6 a.m. General Hans Krebs, chief of the German Army General Staff, walks under a white flag through Soviet lines. He's been authorized to negotiate with Soviet commanders on behalf of the bunker, though Hitler is already dead, and Krebs doesn't know yet whether Goebbels will confirm this. Krebs is escorted to a building in Tempelhof, where General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 8th Guards Army, maintains his headquarters. The scene is surreal. Krebs speaks fluent Russian. He served as military attaché in Moscow before the war. Chuikov is exhausted, having fought continuously for 2 weeks. The two men sit at a table covered with maps and cigarette ash. Krebs announces that Hitler is dead and that the new government wishes to negotiate an armistice. Chuikov's response is immediate: unconditional surrender or continued combat. Those are your options. Krebs tries to negotiate. Perhaps certain units could surrender while preserving government authority. Perhaps specific terms could be arranged. Chuikov, following Stalin's explicit orders, refuses any compromise. Germany can surrender unconditionally, immediately, or Soviet forces will continue destroying Berlin building by building until resistance ceases. The conversation continues for hours, Krebs returning to the bunker multiple times for authorization that never comes. Finally, Chuikov grows impatient. "I'm offering you a way to save German lives," he says. "Every hour you delay, hundreds die. Surrender or don't, but stop wasting my time." Krebs returns to the bunker one final time. Within hours, he'll commit suicide rather than live to see Germany's unconditional surrender. The war's final negotiation has failed. There will be no terms, no conditions, no honorable peace. Only complete capitulation or complete destruction. The issue of surrender terms had plagued German leadership since it became obvious the war was lost. In traditional European warfare, defeated powers negotiated terms that acknowledged military reality while preserving political structures and national honor. Germany might lose territory, pay reparations, accept occupation, but would remain Germany, governed by Germans, with sovereignty eventually restored. This was how wars had ended for centuries. But World War II was different. The Allies, meeting at Casablanca in January 1943, had declared that only unconditional surrender would be accepted from Axis powers. No negotiated peace. No armistice-preserving German government. Total, complete, unconditional capitulation. This policy was controversial. Some argued it would prolong the war by eliminating German incentive to surrender, while the regime retained any capability to resist. Others argued it was necessary given Nazi crimes. Germany had to be completely defeated, its government dissolved, its territory occupied. By May 1945, unconditional surrender was non-negotiable Allied policy. Any German official authorized to negotiate had no room to maneuver. Surrender everything or continue fighting. Those were the only options. The practical problem with unconditional surrender in Berlin was that no single authority controlled all German forces. Hitler was dead. Goebbels was about to commit suicide. Dönitz, appointed Hitler's successor, was in northern Germany with no communication to Berlin. The officers in the bunker could surrender forces under their direct command, perhaps 40,000 troops in the government district. But they had no authority over forces still fighting in other parts of Berlin, in the suburbs, or in units encircled outside the city. Even if Weidling, commanding Berlin's defense, ordered surrender, SS blocking troops might execute anyone attempting to comply. The practical mechanics of surrender, getting orders to scattered units, ensuring compliance, preventing fanatics from continuing resistance, were enormously complicated. This is why Krebs was trying to negotiate terms that would allow gradual, organized surrender. But Chuikov had no interest in complexity. Unconditional surrender meant every German soldier laid down weapons immediately. How Germany accomplished that was Germany's problem. General Helmuth Weidling, the officer actually commanding Berlin's defense, understood the hopelessness of continued resistance. By May 1st, his forces had been compressed into a strip perhaps 3 kilometers wide and 10 kilometers long, running through central Berlin. Soviet forces were attacking from every direction. Ammunition was almost exhausted. Food was critically low. Water supplies were contaminated. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Weidling had perhaps 20 operational tanks remaining from the hundreds that had defended Berlin 2 weeks earlier. His infantry consisted of exhausted Wehrmacht troops, terrified Volkssturm, and fanatic Hitler youth who refused to acknowledge defeat. Continuing to fight would accomplish nothing except additional casualties. But ordering surrender without Hitler's explicit authorization was treason punishable by death. Only Hitler's confirmed death freed Weidling to make his own decision. On May 1st afternoon, after confirming Hitler was dead and Krebs's negotiations had failed, Weidling contacted Soviet commanders and offered unconditional surrender of all forces under his command. The offer was accepted, but implementing that surrender would prove nearly as difficult as the battle itself. The surrender broadcast occurred at 6 a.m. on May 2nd. Weidling, exhausted and defeated, sat before a Soviet microphone and read a statement, ordering all German forces in Berlin to cease resistance immediately. The broadcast was transmitted on multiple frequencies, hoping to reach German units throughout the city. Weidling explained that Hitler was dead, further resistance was pointless, and that all troops should lay down their arms and surrender to Soviet forces. The broadcast reached most German units. Some complied immediately, grateful for permission to stop fighting. Wehrmacht troops, particularly, surrendered in large numbers once ordered to do so, but many SS units ignored the surrender order. They considered Weidling a traitor for surrendering, while German forces still had ammunition and the capacity to resist. These SS units continued fighting some until May 8th, a full week after Weidling's surrender order. Soviet forces had to hunt them down, building by building, bunker by bunker, killing them when they refused to surrender. The final holdouts were in Berlin's subway tunnels, where SS and Hitler Youth had established positions that Soviet forces had difficulty reaching. Some reports suggest Soviet engineers flooded sections of tunnel to force defenders to surface, though whether this resulted in civilian casualties remains disputed and controversial. The German casualties from Berlin's battle defy precise calculation because record-keeping collapsed during the final weeks. Estimates suggest approximately 92,000 to 100,000 German soldiers killed in Berlin itself, with another 120,000 killed in the approaches during the Silo Heights battle and Encirclement. Wounded German soldiers numbered at least 220,000, though many wounded died later from inadequate medical care. German prisoners taken during Berlin's battle and immediate aftermath totaled approximately 134,000. These were soldiers who survived and surrendered. The total suggests that virtually the entire German force defending Berlin, approaching 500,000 men, was killed, wounded, or captured. Very few escaped. The complete destruction of Germany's Berlin garrison exceeded even worst-case projections. And these numbers don't include Volkssturm and Hitler Youth, whose casualties were never properly recorded, but certainly added thousands more to the death toll. Soviet casualties were also staggering. The Berlin operation defined as the period from April 16th to May 2nd, including Silo Heights, the Encirclement, and urban combat cost. Soviet forces 81,116 killed or missing. Wounded numbered 280,251. Total casualties exceeded 360,000. These numbers exceeded Soviet casualties at Stalingrad and approached losses at Kursk. The battle consumed entire rifle divisions. Some Soviet units suffered 70 to 80% casualties. Tank losses were catastrophic. Approximately 2,000 Soviet armored vehicles were destroyed during the operation. Artillery losses were also severe. The Berlin operation was the Red Army's costliest campaign of 1945, exceeding casualties from the Vistula-Oder offensive, the East Prussian operations, and the conquest of Austria combined. The sheer scale of loss illustrated that even with overwhelming superiority, urban warfare extracts terrible costs from attackers. Soviet planners had estimated 15,000 casualties to take Berlin. The actual number was 20 times higher, but admitting such catastrophic losses would undermine the victory narrative, so official Soviet accounts minimized casualties, often reporting only killed while ignoring wounded or combining figures from multiple operations to obscure Berlin's specific toll. The civilian death toll was perhaps the most tragic aspect of Berlin's fall. Estimates suggest approximately 125,000 civilian deaths occurred during the battle period, April 16th to May 2nd. Some died in artillery bombardments, others in crossfire, others in building collapses. Thousands died from inability to get medical care for treatable conditions, appendicitis, childbirth complications, cardiac events because hospitals were destroyed or unreachable. Hundreds died from Soviet soldiers' violence, both intentional killings and sexual assaults that resulted in death. The civilian toll included all ages: infants who died from dehydration when water supplies were cut, elderly who died from exposure in bombed-out buildings, children who starved when food distribution collapsed. The deaths were recorded, if at all, in fragmentary local records that documented names, but often nothing else. Reconstructing exact civilian casualties proved impossible. Too many bodies buried in rubble, too many records destroyed, too much chaos during the battle and aftermath. The 125,000 figure is an estimate based on population changes in cemetery records. The true number might be higher. It's unlikely to be lower. The missing category, approximately 95,000 German civilians who disappeared during Berlin's battle and immediate aftermath, represents one of the war's great tragedies. Some undoubtedly died during combat, their bodies never recovered or identified. Others died from disease, starvation, or exposure in the weeks after the battle when infrastructure had collapsed. But a significant number, perhaps 30 to 40,000, were deported to the Soviet Union as forced labor. Soviet authorities arrested German civilians, particularly men of military age, and transported them to labor camps in the USSR. Many died in these camps from overwork, disease, and malnutrition. Some survivors returned to Germany in the 1950s. Others died in captivity and were buried in unmarked graves. The deportations were illegal under international law, but occurred anyway, Soviet authorities considering them appropriate compensation for German destruction of the Soviet Union. The families of disappeared civilians spent years hoping for their return. Many never learned what happened to missing relatives. The uncertainty was its own form of torture, not knowing whether your husband, father, brother was dead or might someday return. By May 8, 1945 VE Day, victory in Europe, all German resistance in Berlin had ceased. The city was completely occupied by Soviet forces. The battle had lasted 16 days, from the initial assault on April 16th to the final surrender on May 2nd, with additional mopping-up operations continuing through early May. In that 16 days, Berlin had been transformed from a functioning capital of 3 million into a devastated wasteland. Approximately 80% of buildings in the central districts were damaged or destroyed. Water, electricity, sewage, and gas services had collapsed. Roads were impassable, blocked by rubble and destroyed vehicles. Telephone and telegraph lines were dead. Fires still burned in many areas, no firefighting capability remaining to extinguish them. The smell of death permeated everything: decomposing bodies buried in rubble, sewage from broken pipes, smoke from fires. Berlin was not just defeated but destroyed, its infrastructure so thoroughly shattered that rebuilding would take decades. The city that had thought itself invincible in January was unrecognizable by May. And the survivors, those who had endured the battle, faced the enormous question: what comes next? Germany was defeated. Berlin was occupied. The Nazi regime was gone, but the suffering was not over. In many ways, it was just beginning. May 2nd, 1945, evening. Soviet troops occupy a residential building in the Charlottenburg district. The combat has moved on. This area was secured 2 days ago. Now comes the liberation that Berlin's women have been dreading. A Soviet captain, drunk on looted schnapps, leads several soldiers through apartments, kicking down doors, searching for women. In one apartment, they find a mother and her 2 teenage daughters hiding in a closet. What follows is repeated throughout Berlin over the next days and weeks. Systematic sexual violence that Soviet authorities will deny for 50 years, and that victims will struggle to discuss for even longer. The women survive but are traumatized in ways that will affect them for life. This scene plays out thousands of times across Berlin. Soviet soldiers, having fought their way across a devastated landscape, having seen what Germans did to the Soviet Union, exact revenge on the civilian population. Not all Soviet troops participate. Some maintain discipline, some actively prevent atrocities. But enough participate that sexual violence becomes a defining characteristic of Berlin's occupation. This is the dark underside of victory: liberation that feels like conquest, justice that looks like revenge, and violence that perpetuates trauma across generations. The Red Army conquered Berlin militarily. Now it would subjugate Berlin's population through terror and violence. Victory celebrations in Moscow would not mention this. Soviet propaganda would not acknowledge it. But for Berlin's women, the battle's end marked the beginning of a different nightmare. The scale of sexual violence in Berlin during and immediately after the battle remains controversial and difficult to quantify precisely. Estimates based on medical records, abortion statistics, and later testimony suggest between 95,000 and 130,000 women in Berlin were raped during the period from April to August 1945. Some researchers suggest numbers as high as 140,000. The violence occurred across all age groups. Documented cases include victims as young as 8 and as old as 80. Social class provided no protection. Soviet soldiers assaulted women in wealthy Charlottenburg and poor Prenzlauer Berg with equal frequency. The violence was sometimes individual, a single soldier assaulting a woman he encountered. More often, it was collective multiple soldiers assaulting the same victim repeatedly. Some women were raped dozens of times by different soldiers over weeks. The trauma was compounded by the inability to escape or get help. Police didn't exist. Soviet authorities either didn't care or couldn't control their troops. German men who attempted to defend women were often shot. The violence created a climate of terror where women couldn't leave their homes without risking assault. And staying home provided no safety because Soviet soldiers would break down doors searching for victims. The reasons for this widespread sexual violence are complex and don't reduce to simple explanations. Soviet soldiers had experienced and witnessed years of German brutality in the Soviet Union. They had seen villages burned, civilians executed, women raped by German troops during occupation. The desire for revenge was real and powerful. Additionally, Soviet propaganda had depicted Germans as subhuman enemies deserving no mercy. Years of dehumanizing propaganda made it psychologically easier to commit atrocities against German civilians. Alcohol played a role. Soviet troops looted wine cellars and distilleries throughout Berlin, and drunk soldiers were more likely to commit violence. The breakdown of military discipline during urban combat meant officers had less control over troops' behavior, and some Soviet commanders tacitly approved or explicitly encouraged violence as reward for soldiers who had fought their way to Berlin. Marshal Zhukov's response to complaints about sexual violence was reportedly, "We lecture our soldiers too much. Let them have some initiative." Whether he actually said this is disputed, but the quote circulated widely and reflected command attitudes that tolerated or minimized the violence. Not all Soviet troops participated in atrocities, and some actively tried to prevent them. Soviet military law technically prohibited rape, and some commanders enforced discipline strictly, executing soldiers caught committing sexual assaults. Ilya Ehrenberg, the Soviet writer, published an appeal on May 4th warning troops that violence against German civilians dishonored the Red Army, but enforcement was inconsistent. A woman's fate often depended on which Soviet unit controlled her district. Some units maintained strict discipline, posting guards to protect civilians and punishing infractions severely. Other units were barbaric, commanders participating in or ignoring systematic violence. The inconsistency created its own terror. You couldn't predict whether Soviet soldiers entering your building would be disciplined professionals or violent criminals. Some women survived unharmed through luck. Others were assaulted despite taking every precaution. The randomness made the terror complete. German women developed survival strategies that revealed the horror of their situation. Some tried to make themselves unattractive, covering their faces with dirt, wearing multiple layers of clothing, cutting their hair short. This rarely worked. Soviet soldiers weren't deterred by appearances. Some women sought protection by attaching themselves to individual Soviet officers, essentially becoming concubines in exchange for protection from other soldiers. This strategy worked for some, but came with its own trauma. Some women hid in basements, in ruins, in forests outside the city, but hiding was only temporary. Eventually you needed food, water, supplies. Some women simply accepted that assault was inevitable and tried to minimize harm, cooperating to avoid being beaten or killed, then trying to forget and survive. The psychological damage from these strategies was profound. Women blamed themselves for not being better hidden, for not fighting harder, for surviving through cooperation. The victim blaming that pervaded post-war German society, suggestions that women who were assaulted must have done something to provoke it, compounded trauma. The medical aftermath of sexual violence was catastrophic. Berlin's hospitals and clinics, already overwhelmed with battle casualties, faced an epidemic of sexually transmitted diseases and unwanted pregnancies. Estimates suggest approximately 10,000 pregnancies resulted from rapes in Berlin during 1945 and 46. Some women carried these pregnancies to term. Others sought abortions, though abortion was illegal under German law. Black market abortionists operated throughout Berlin, performing procedures in unsanitary conditions without anesthesia. Some women died from botched abortions. Others survived but were permanently injured. The babies born from rape faced their own tragedies. Some were abandoned. Some were raised by mothers who couldn't help but see their attacker's face in their child's features. Some were placed for adoption. The Russenkinder, Russian children, as they were called, faced discrimination and stigma throughout their lives. Their existence was a reminder of trauma that German society preferred to forget. Soviet authorities denied the sexual violence for decades. Official Soviet histories of Berlin's capture didn't mention rape, instead emphasizing liberation and reconstruction. Soviet veterans who later wrote memoirs either omitted the topic or claimed it was exaggerated anti-Soviet propaganda. Not until the 1990s, after the Soviet Union's collapse, did Russian authorities begin acknowledging what had happened. Even then, acknowledgement came with justifications, references to German atrocities in the Soviet Union, suggestions that German propaganda had exaggerated the scale, claims that all armies in all wars commit such violence. The defensive responses revealed how difficult it was for Russia to reconcile its pride in defeating Nazi Germany with the reality of how that victory was achieved. Could you celebrate Soviet soldiers' sacrifice while acknowledging their crimes? Could you honor veterans while recognizing that some committed atrocities? These questions still provoke controversy in Russia, where Victory Day remains a sacred national holiday. German silence about sexual violence lasted even longer than Soviet denial. In post-war West Germany, discussing rape by Soviet soldiers risked accusations of anti-Soviet propaganda during Cold War tensions. In East Germany, controlled by Soviets, discussing the topic was literally illegal propaganda against the occupying power, so German women who survived assault were told to remain silent. Society didn't want to hear about it. Families didn't want to discuss it. Husbands who returned from prisoner of war camps often divorced wives who had been raped, considering them damaged goods. The psychological burden of surviving trauma and then being forced into silence caused immeasurable harm. Suicide rates among Berlin's women spiked in May and June 1945. Some suicides were women who couldn't endure the trauma. Others were women who became pregnant from rape and chose death over bearing their attacker's child. Not until the 1990s did German society begin openly discussing the sexual violence of Berlin's occupation, spurred by works like Antony Beevor's History and the memoir A Woman in Berlin, published anonymously. The Russian government's response to renewed discussion of sexual violence in Berlin has been consistently defensive. When Antony Beevor published Berlin, The Downfall 1945 in 2002, Russian veterans groups and government officials denounced it as anti-Russian propaganda. The Russian ambassador to Britain accused Beevor of lies and slander. Russian media published articles claiming that accounts of systematic rape were fabrications designed to diminish Soviet victory. The vehement denials revealed how central the Great Patriotic War narrative remains to Russian national identity. Acknowledging widespread atrocities by Soviet troops complicates the story of noble sacrifice and liberation. But historical honesty requires acknowledging complexity that Soviet soldiers could be simultaneously victims of German aggression and perpetrators of atrocities against German civilians, that the Red Army's victory over Nazism was real and significant, and that victory was accomplished through methods that included war crimes. These truths aren't contradictory, but accepting them requires nuance that nationalist narratives discourage. Beyond sexual violence, the Soviet occupation of Berlin included massive looting and deportations. Soviet trophy brigades systematically looted Berlin's museums, libraries, and private collections. Artworks, rare books, scientific instruments, industrial machinery, anything valuable was crated and shipped to the Soviet Union. Some loot was official policy. The Soviet government considered Germany's cultural and industrial assets appropriate reparations for German destruction of the Soviet Union. But much looting was individual soldiers taking whatever they could carry: watches, jewelry, cameras, radios. Soviet soldiers famously collected watches, sometimes wearing multiple on each arm. The looting was so systematic that Berlin was effectively stripped of portable wealth during the first weeks of occupation. Some looted art has been returned in recent decades. Much remains in Russian museums, and Russia has refused to return it, claiming it as legitimate war reparations. The seizure of industrial equipment was even more damaging. Soviet engineers dismantled entire factories, machine tools, generators, even railroad tracks, and shipped everything east. The dismantling crippled Berlin's economy for years, eliminating the industrial capacity needed for reconstruction. The contrast between official victory narratives and ground-level reality was stark. In Moscow, huge celebrations marked Germany's defeat. Stalin gave speeches about the triumph of Soviet arms and the liberation of Europe from fascism. Soviet citizens genuinely celebrated they had survived 4 years of devastating war and emerged victorious. But in Berlin, liberation looked different. For Soviet troops, it meant looting, drinking, and taking what they considered earned spoils. For German civilians, it meant occupation by an army that many feared and that provided no security or order. For Berlin's women especially, liberation was meaningless. They had been freed from Nazi rule only to face sexual violence from their liberators. This gap between official narrative and lived experience characterized the post-war period. History would remember Soviet forces defeating Hitler. Survivors would remember what that defeat cost. Both memories were true. Both were incomplete without the other. The long-term psychological effects of Berlin's occupation trauma persist across generations. Women who survived the battle and occupation carried trauma their entire lives. Many experienced PTSD, depression, anxiety, and difficulty forming relationships. Their trauma affected their children, even children conceived consensually after the war ended. Trauma passes through generations. Children of traumatized parents experience higher rates of psychological difficulties, even when they don't know the details of their parents' experiences. The Russenkinder children, conceived through rape, faced additional burdens. Questions about their paternity, social stigma, and complicated relationships with mothers, who sometimes couldn't help but associate their children with trauma. Some of these children, now elderly, are only now learning the truth about their conception. The reckoning with Berlin's occupation trauma continues decades later, as survivors die and historians work to document what happened before living memory disappears. The questions remain difficult. How do we acknowledge historical atrocities without perpetuating ethnic hatred? How do we honor Soviet victory over Nazism while acknowledging Soviet crimes? How do we remember victims without reducing them to passive sufferers rather than people who survived and rebuilt lives? These questions have no easy answers, but asking them honestly is necessary for historical justice.